information. We want to not present to families any false hope that, hey, our kid came out just fine, your kid will too, but yet hold on and see what's going to happen. See what it actually ends up being, and don't just take the doctor's word for it.
Only 5 to 10% live to see their first birthday.
Yeah, so
statistically.
And for me, I think that's worth it to anybody to be given a chance at life, and not to go by what happened the last time kind of deal.
The importance of the foundation is it's a twofold. Number one is to just offer resources to families. We want them to know that if you face this diagnosis, there are families who have experienced it too, and the outcomes may not be the same, but you don't have to go through it alone. There are challenges, so we want to be able to help those families find the resources, and in a lot of instances be the resource. The second importance to me, to us, I would say, is to change the medical perspective. The trisomy 18 diagnosis medically is termed incompatible with life, and that gives leverage to a lot of doctors to refuse to give you care. So we want to change the narrative in the medical world.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I am Sarita Edwards. I am the CEO and president here at the E.WE Foundation. So welcome to the E.WE Foundation's 2022 Leap into Advocacy Virtual Summit. The E.WE Foundation is a patient-centered healthcare advocacy organization. Our mission is to provide resources and support to families living with rare diseases like Edwards syndrome or trisomy 18, while changing the medical perspective through efforts of advocacy, education, and public policy. We believe early diagnoses and access to diagnostic therapies and resources can create better health outcomes for chronically ill infants and children. The E.WE Foundation is dedicated to ensuring patient populations have equitable access to quality health care, resources, health and financial literacy, and disease education. Patients with chronic illnesses should have immediate access to quality health care and medical resources, including economic assistance and supplemental support. We are committed to raising awareness about trisomy 18 and rare diseases like it, and bridging the gap between diagnosis, delivery, and healthcare coordination. Our theme for this year's conference is utilizing social health and digital concepts to influence critical health decisions. We'll explore how we as advocates, patients, and caregivers use social health and digital concepts to transform our approach to health and expand our access to care. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you for being here. Welcome. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kristine for a few welcome announcements.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kristine Edwards, founding partner and VP of Operations, E.WE Foundation. I have the welcome announcements for you today. So this event is being recorded. The replay will be available on our YouTube channel. You can access our YouTube channel from our website, theewefoundation.org. This event is approved for 4 CEUs, sorry. So those of you that request these will receive an email certificate after today's summit. Give us a few days to get those into your inbox. If you have any questions, you can get those into the Q&A box or use the chat feature. Closed captioning is available, so use the closed captioning option at the bottom to enable the transcript feature on your Zoom session. And we'd like to thank the Every Life Foundation's Rare Giving program for being our exclusive sponsor for today's event. And now, we hope you enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me today. I will be your moderator for the first session. So who am I? My name is AudreyStephannie Maghiro. I graduated in college in 2019 with a degree in molecular and cellular biology and a minor in Spanish. After graduating, I went and became a missionary for 2 years and returned to Boston in 2021, last year, where I serve as the research coordinator at the Undiagnosed Diseases Network. So I don't know if many people know about the network, but the Undiagnosed Diseases Network is a research study that tries to improve access to diagnostic resources for patients who have had long odysseys for their medical conditions that still remain unsolved. So I like to think of it as, I like to think of it as we try to, leverage scientific resources, but also one of the biggest resources that we will also be talking about is the social health resource, which we use or we call the UDN PEER, which stands for the Patient Engagement and Empowerment Resource. So oftentimes, many people, either have gone through doctors who see something or do not understand what's going on behind the surface, and oftentimes that their patient care is limited to that network or that doctor's network. And so what the Undiagnosed Diseases Network attempts to do is basically to increase or expand that network, right? So maybe there's a doctor or a scientist or a clinician who has seen something similar in Washington, but if you are in Florida, you might not know, right? So the goal is to, hopefully, ask patients to, or their doctors to reach out to or apply for the network, and from there, hopefully begin them on a more, answering journey. So if you are like me, I did not know that I was participating in social health before Sarita, reached out to me. But that resource of the patient engagement and empowerment resource of utilizing social media, or maybe someone else who might be going through something similar to you with your own disease or condition, is something that I didn't know. So I really love Health Union's definition of what social health is, which is the dynamic real-time action people take to find meaningful connections and share information that impact the health journey. So again, PEER is one of the most grateful resources that I didn't even know about within the UDN, where patients can engage with our Facebook group or engage with the board members on PEER and say, hey, this is something that, my doctors are saying is a possibility. Can you tell me a little bit more about this? Or this is what we're seeing. Can you tell me more about this? And we've also had patients who, have gotten diagnoses or new conditions diagnosed based on someone seeing something similar within, themselves or their children, and saying, hey, we would like to, get our genome sequenced because it's our child, or we are presenting similar to what you said on your blog. So I think that this next panel is going to be so important and so fascinating if we, have the time to just go into that, which which we will, be doing in the next 2 minutes. So this next session is going to be called Utilizing Social Health Concepts to Transform Healthcare Solutions, right? And so to start us off on that conversation, we will be using, or we will be hearing from Sarah Coff and Kristine Zerkowski. And then afterwards, we will be having a fireside chat in which Ilana will be joining the conversation. So I will turn it over to them.
So good morning, I'm Kristine Zerkowski, and I'm here with my colleague, Sarah Coff. We're members of the community team at Health Union, and today we are representing Health Union Social Health Network. We're here to share some of our published research on social health, ways to leverage social health to increase impact of your advocacy, and we'll talk about some real life examples to get your wheels turning on how to apply it to your own patient leadership. Trudy, you can go to slide 2. Well, actually, you can go to slide 3 if that's all right. That's just us. All right. So for those of you who don't know Health Union, we believe that the voice of the personal experience from people impacted by complex health conditions is the most important voice in healthcare. Through the largest network of online health communities and patient leaders, we drive unique and impactful conversations about health that reach and engage people in the most important points of their journey. We have currently have 40 communities, and we're growing, and all of those communities focus on different condition areas that you see on your screen now. And then in the middle, our newest community, the Social Health Network. So the goal of the Social Health Network is to support leaders across all health conditions. Instead of a health-specific focus for this new community, we have focused on health leaders. So we're meeting people where they are in their advocacy journey and helping them feel more empowered to share their voices and make an impact. Next slide, please. So the Social Health Network is a new community that just launched this past month. It's the result of Health Union's Ambassador Program, formerly called the Pillars Program, and WeGo Health Patient Leader Network, coming together to create the ultimate health leader community. We focus on patients, caregivers, HCPs, and aim to bring the community resources, panels, events, and paid opportunities to increase your advocacy efforts. If you want to learn more, we'll be sharing links later in the presentation, but you can always go to socialhealthnetwork.com to sign up. Next slide, please. So before we jump into social health, I want to talk about patient leaders and who they are, because patient leaders are really what makes social health possible. If this is a new term to you as well, I'll take a step back and say that patient leaders are individuals sharing their story or a loved one's story with the hopes of helping others. This research proves that the work that you're doing does make an impact, and it's really a big one. Patient leaders and individuals sharing their stories are able to help others feel less alone, have more information than they did when they were in their shoes, and then make changes within the healthcare system. We really consider each and every one of you here today to be a patient leader. You're out there leading the charge for patients across all sorts of different condition platforms. You as patient leaders are the heart and soul of the community, and you help others by sharing your advocacy efforts. So what is social health? I know AudreyStephannie mentioned it before, but I'll say again, we define social health as the dynamic real-time actions people take to find meaningful connections and share information throughout the health journey, ultimately leading them to better health outcomes. The term might be new to you, but the concept is not new to anyone on this call. In fact, the concept is something that each and every one of us and you are partaking in every day. So how do we know that? We found through research and educational campaigns to our network for this to be true. So over the last few months, we've launched an email campaign aimed at educating the network on the power of social health. And we received an overwhelming amount of patient leader definitions for social health. And as our social health education campaign continued, our research findings only solidified the impact that patient leaders like yourselves have on the overall community and social health. As a network, our goals, benefits, and strategy all revolve around optimizing social health and empowering patient leaders. But as individual patient leaders advocating for your respective communities, there are several ways you can use social health to help. So to describe social health, we want to share 3 reasons why patients and caregivers are using social health, which will then easily translate into how you can make the most of social health and amplify your advocacy efforts to increase your reach as an advocate. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Sarah at this point.
Thanks, Kristine. So reason number one, patients and caregivers actively engage in social health. So they're using social health every day, and it's such a valuable resource for everyone. So if you go to the next slide. So as we know, patients are constantly seeking connections and opportunities to discuss their shared experiences living with a health condition. And this is relatable content that helps foster this engagement. In fact, results from a recent social health survey that Health Union conducted in 2021, which was completed by more than 2,300 people, show that 95% of patients use online health social resources for health reasons. This is the first of several data points that we'll be sharing throughout the presentation. So if we go to the next slide. So meaningful interactions drive higher engagement. While we know relatable content provides opportunities for patients to connect, content alone really doesn't provide a sufficient experience for an engaging online health community. So this is where, as a patient leader like yourself, has the power to help increase engagement in the social health area by sharing your own experience. As you can see from the chart, the average Health Union online health community engagement is significantly higher than the average online Facebook engagement rate. So online health communities are able to achieve this level of engagement because they focus on social support, engagement, and active moderation. Essentially, online health communities provide a level of comfort and support that people may not have otherwise in their day-to-day lives. You can go to the next slide.
So moving on to reason number two, social health provides information, connection, and validation at the right moment. Next slide, please. So in our published analysis, we found that validation, empathy, and understanding play a truly significant role in meeting people where they are. We analyzed Facebook comments across 6 of Health Union's condition-specific communities, and of all the comments, 58% were expressions of social support. And of that 58%, nearly half were comments validating the knowledge and experience of others, and a third conveyed empathy and understanding. I'd be willing to bet that many of you listening today can totally relate to this. How many of you have felt validated when you see others sharing their stories that are similar to yours? Or how many of you have received messages from community members expressing gratitude for you sharing those moments and experiences with them? Patients and caregivers are looking for information and validation, and this has really proven to benefit the community overall. Next slide, please. So as a patient leader in the space, you know firsthand how impactful it can be to share resources about your condition and your journey. In our survey, when we asked patients and caregivers, when asked what patients and caregivers have been able to do as a result of using online resources, people shared actual tangible and emotional outcomes. Social health has helped people living with chronic health conditions to better understand their condition, to better communicate with their doctor, to feel more informed about their treatment options, to feel smarter about their condition, and honestly, and I think most importantly, to feel less alone. So I ask you, can you think of a time that you used information you gathered from an online source, or perhaps a patient leader, to help you one of these buckets? This really proves others are doing this too. Next slide, please.
So reason number 3, social health guides treatment discussions. If you go to the next slide, please, Rita. So people engage with social health most often during critical decisions in their treatment journeys. Patients reported using online social health resources when finding or learning about new medication or treatment options at the time of their diagnosis or a loved one's, and when starting or switching to a new treatment. These numbers indicate how important online health resources prove to be for patient outcomes. And I'm sure some of you listening today can think of a time during your own journey when you use these social resources when looking into your loved ones or yourselves' treatment options. Go to the next slide. So more than 8 in 10 people will utilize the information gathered online in conversations with an HCP. So the data from our social health survey shows this, that 80% of people are likely to talk to their HCP about a conversation that they had online with a fellow patient leader, which is pretty awesome. So I'm curious if anyone here has learned anything, has learned something online that they then brought up to their doctor, such as a new medication they wanted to try out, or an unusual symptom that they've been noticing, or even like unusual side effects. If you've ever had this experience, feel free to share it in the chat. We would love to just see your experience as well. And then on the next slide, community interactions create space for decision-making. So as we all know, living with a chronic illness can feel extremely isolating, which is why we feel that online support is essential. These community interactions we've spoken about create space for better decision-making, which more often than not lead to improved patient outcomes. You can go to the next slide.
So we know that was a lot of data, but we feel it's really important to share because it truly showcases the power, showcases the power that each of us holds to help other patients and caregivers. So now that we've talked through how others are using social health, we want to show you some real life examples of patient leaders within our network and how they're helping to cater to those 8 in 10 people who are going online to find information and have conversations with our HCP. Next slide, please. So, as we mentioned previously, thanks in part to patient leaders like yourself, 86% of patients better understand their condition, and most importantly, 62% of patients feel less alone based on information that others are sharing online. So in thinking about the content that you post online, think about what might have helped you communicate better with your doctor, and what might have helped you feel more informed about a treatment option, or what might have helped you feel more confident and knowledgeable about your own condition. So these 2 examples on this slide shown here are ways that patient leaders have stepped up to provide support to patients and caregivers in the moments that have really mattered most. Brooke and Amber are 2 IBD patients who realized that the need to help and support mothers who have IBD is critical. They launched IBD Moms and have created an incredible platform, dedicated to this community. So Kristine on this slide, who some of you may know, is a powerhouse when it comes to the rare disease space. She's used Clubhouse to create welcoming and impressive space for those who want to connect over their own shared experiences. All of these leaders have tapped into their life experience, the professional skills that they may bring to the table, and have created supportive platforms for others in their own way. Next slide, please.
So here are a few examples of patient leaders who have spoken out about the need to improve the patient-doctor relationship. Vicky, who's a contributor on our psoriasis community, wrote an article about the relationship she has with her doctor and how she navigates difficult conversations. And then Ilana, who you'll see on our panel later today, is phenomenal at putting out social health content. She shared this reel that she created on how to advocate for yourself as a rare disease patient leader. Next slide.
So patients and caregivers are looking for information to help them make effective health decisions. Many of those decisions come down to getting a diagnosis, starting or switching treatments, or just learning more about their condition. 2 examples here are Dawn, who is also a contributor at Health Union. She created a space on Twitter for members of the chronic illness community called Spoonie Chat. This Twitter chat brings together members from all over and discusses different topics related to their patient experience. So many of the members walk away with information that they didn't have before. And then Jerry, who's another amazing patient leader, uses Instagram Reels to show the realities of living with pulmonary arterial hypertension. Her content is honestly so relatable and so energizing. She really takes the approach of sharing out the day-to-day life with her own personal experience with treatments, clinical trials, and symptoms that patients and caregivers should be looking out for. Next slide.
So supporting patients in their health journey. As we mentioned previously, this data shows that patient leaders are supporting individuals across the entire continuum of care. From diagnosis to management, our research reveals that some common ways patients and caregivers leverage social health to understand test results or learning about new treatments. So 2 examples I wanted to share with you are how patient leaders are filling in information for these points. So here we have Damien, who has publicly shared getting infusions. He has a YouTube video on this, the expectations, the challenges, and questions that others should be thinking about before they go and receive this treatment. He's also just very personable and fun and nice to listen to. So I highly recommend checking it out. Candace actually used an off-label medication to get her ITP in remission. So she shares her journey and clinical data that has helped encourage other ITP patients to talk to their doctor about trying similar situations. Patient leaders, as I'm sure you all know, hold so much power when it comes to social health. They're the driving force behind another patient or caregiver not having to face the challenges and isolation or a lack of knowledge that others have had to face in the past. Next slide.
So now what? How can you tap into social health to help amplify your own advocacy efforts? The great thing I would say about patient leadership is it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. So whether you're just starting out or if you've been advocating for years, you can take your own path to advocacy, and it can look different for everyone. We hope the information that we showcased can at least get your wheels turning, and that it shows you how important your own story can be. It can really be life-changing for others in the community. You'd be surprised at the impact that you can make on a single person or many people just by sharing your own story. So we've outlined some ideas here on the slide, and we will be sending this information to all of you after this panel discussion, so you don't have to write down all of these links link out to some potential additional resources that you can use. Next slide. So at Health Union, we are experts in social health with over a decade of knowledge in the online health community space and beyond. If you're not already part of the Social Health Network, we invite all of you here today to come and join us. We're all leaders from across condition areas. We're all working towards the common goal, and that's to help improve health outcomes for patients within our communities. There's so much to learn and draw upon from each other, and so we'd love to have you. And that's it. I think we're moving on to our panel discussion now.
Yes, thank you, Kristine and Sarah, for that great panel discussion, panel presentation. We will be moving on to the fireside chat in which Ilana will be joining us. So please feel free to share any questions that you guys have or had throughout the presentation in the chat or the Q&A. If not, we also have some questions here. I will give people a couple seconds to write their question if they do have one. But in the meantime, the first question that I have is often people's journeys. Like, how did you guys find yourself into the social health world? And what is your experience being there, either as a patient or working for Health Union?
I guess I can start. So I'm Ilana, Jacqueline, by the way. Hello. I'm an associate director with Health Union as part of their community team, and I'm a rare disease patient leader. And I've been in the patient health, social health community for as long as it's been around, I think. And for me, I thinking back, there's so many different ways that I kind of snuck into the social health world without even realizing that I was in it. But social health has really meant having an accessible community for me, which is something that's not always widely available for so many patients. And as someone with a chronic illness, disability, whatever you want to call it, there are parts of life that can be so isolating, especially in areas of support. And when I think back to the very first day of my diagnosis, I'm being rushed to the hospital, and what am I doing? I'm on my phone. I'm looking at the message board of my disease's nonprofit organization. And that, that two-way lane to ask questions, to see the experiences of others was everything. I use social media and the connections with other patients that I've made through it as a lifeline. And I get second opinions on what to do about treatment and how to cope with all that, all the indirect ways that that chronic disease impacts my life. And now I also have the opportunity to offer that support to others and show that, no matter how rare or unique the disease is, so much of the patient experience is really universal. And we can find a lot of solutions for unnecessary ways in which we struggle by sharing those experiences, and sometimes just illustrating how common they really are.
Yeah, thanks, Ilana. I can speak on behalf of the cystic fibrosis community. So I am a community manager for the CF community at Health Union. And I constantly just see community members discussing unusual symptoms that they've noticed and tips that they maybe have brought up to their care team that they might not have, heard from otherwise from their doctors. And these organic conversations have really led to patients feeling less alone, but also improve their emotional and physical well-being. So we, let's say we post an article or publish an article, and we might get comments saying like, oh, I didn't realize this was connected to CF. And I'm sure, that's similar to other conditions. And I think just sharing that information has been so useful, not only in just sharing your own story, but having help people who maybe have not yet been diagnosed or just recently diagnosed. So I just think there's so many useful resources out there, and connecting with people can do so many incredible things for each other.
Kristine, would you like to go, or would you like me to move on?
I'm not sure I can add anything too meaningful to that, but I will say, so I'm not a patient advocate myself, but I've been with Health Union for quite some time. And when I started off, I was managing our community for folks with multiple sclerosis. And I think the work was just, it struck me how meaningful the work is to be able to interact with people going through such a life-altering diagnosis, and the impact and meaningful differences that having a community for people who can find others going through their experience, like what a difference that can make for them. I remember early on, one of our amazing patient leaders wrote an article called "The Perils of Showering with MS," and it's such a very specific topic, but it just really resonated with the community because the way that Devin had written his article, it was so relatable in the heat impact and the slippery floor of a shower, and how that experience is so different for people who have MS versus folks who may not have a chronic health condition at all. So my journey at Health Union and connecting with patients who have shared their experiences and made a difference has truly, honestly made a huge difference in my own life. And I'm just blown away every day by the power of community. And it's just so amazing that community can mean so many different things. And that the fact that online communities really make a difference in people's lives is just amazing to me.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Thank you. So I think last time I checked numbers, there are 25 to 30 million people living with rare diseases or a rare condition today in the US. And part of what we're doing at the Coordinating Center for the Undiagnosed Diseases Network is trying to find a way to create some sort of training for medical professionals when they are faced with a patient who might be dealing with a rare disease, right? Or a condition that is maybe not rare, but is presenting in a very unusual way, right? And so the reason why I'm bringing that up is with 25 to 30 million people, I think there can be a scale of injustice sometimes, where these patients have to become the patient advocate. They have to become the patient leader. They have to go and do the research and then present that to the professionals, right? And so I guess my question to you all is what is the spectrum, right? Because maybe someone might not have the time to dedicate time, like for a blog, that might be all consuming, or to become an influencer to a certain extent, right? So what is the spectrum in which people can actually still be able to be a part of this community, whether it's just to be participants in the first, few years, or to stay there if they desire, or is there, what is and also on top of that, what are the pressures of becoming this leader if you might be N of one or N of very few who are faced with a rare condition?
Wow, that's a great question. And I just want to go back and say that exactly as you described, there is this horrible pressure for rare disease patients where they do have to be the doctor, the researcher, the advocate, and the patient all at the same time. And that is incredibly stressful. And nobody trains you for that. You don't wake up and go to school to become a rare disease patient. You are expected to, learn how to survive in this world that is not built for us. And so it's definitely a spectrum of getting from kind of being like a lurker in the community. And we see that a lot at Health Union and across all of our communities, that we have a lot of people who read the articles and, they're clearly looking on the message boards and things like that, but maybe they're not contributing just yet. And that's perfectly fine. There's a learning curve. There's definitely a period of time where what you need to do to survive is just absorb and look and read and see all these other people and what their experiences have been, so that you can start deciding how you want your experience to be. And later on, if you kind of become like a veteran rare disease patient where you've gone through the system, you've gone through these experiences, you've had the classic medical gaslighting in the ER, then you can go and you can share your experiences in whatever way you feel is going to be most impactful. And there are so many ways to do that. That can be as simple as answering questions on message boards, or it can expand to writing articles, or can expand to writing a book, or going on social media, or being in documentaries. I mean, it's absolutely endless the ways that you can contribute if you feel like you have the time, energy, and space to contribute. And that's not required of you. All that's required of you is to be there for yourself through an extremely difficult journey. But certainly, if you have the capacity to do so, sharing your journey along the way can be so helpful to so many.
That's so good. Thanks, Ilana. So we had a question come in, and the question was, and I think you referred to it in your answer, Ilana, about medical gaslighting, right? Whether it's the doctor might not believe you, or they're telling you that is not what you had. One of our patients over the other day was telling me that, she brought her son in, and the doctor literally said, the last thing I learned about mitochondrial diseases was my first year of medical school. I don't believe they exist, right? So just absurd stories like that, right? So how do you deal with that? And how do you equip and arm yourself for the potential of medical gaslighting, if that's not a term we're coining it today, right? But yeah.
I mean, it's not even a potential, it is assured. It is assured that if you have a rare disease, you're going to experience that. And that is something that I've thought so much about, and I put a lot of content out there on how to have those conversations, whether you're in an exam room at a doctor's office or you're in the emergency room and you're experiencing that, because those are the two main places. But yeah, I mean, patients are definitely going to run across doctors who just haven't heard of their condition and therefore don't believe it exists. They'll try to reverse that diagnosis into something that's a little simpler and easier for them to consume and treat. And that's not what they should be doing, because that is completely unhelpful to the patient. So there are several ways to fight back against medical gaslighting. And again, it goes back to that patient really having to be the researcher, the doctor, the advocate, and the patient at the same time. You really have to come in armed with, everything about your diagnosis. So for instance, when I go to the emergency room, I literally have, it's not a binder, because you can't even expect them to read a binder these days. It is a presentation deck. I am opening it up and being like, this is my disease. This is what you need to do. This is the things that you cannot do. Very simple bullet pointed things to make it easier for them to digest, which is horrible. We should never have to be put in that position, but realistically we are. And as part of our survival, that's just kind of how we have to let it play out. If you look on my TikTok or Instagram, I post a lot of reels about the language that you want to use when you're in a situation that involves medical gaslighting. So it's things like, just kind of repeating back, like, these are the symptoms that I've told you that I have. These are the tests that I'm asking you to run. Can you document the refusal to run those tests? Just so I have that in the file. Because more often than not, they're going to have a really hard time defending the actions or lack of actions that can put you in real peril, or put your children in real peril. So being able to document that, kind of summarize what is happening, and put it back on them. And then it's also a matter too of, if you have the capacity to do so, sometimes just walking away from these kind of doctors who are not believing you when you have, it seems so silly when you're in that situation, because so many of these rare diseases are undeniably real. Like it's right there on the blood test, it's right there on the CAT scan, it's right there in your whole genome sequencing. It is undeniable, but they will deny it. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're not in a crisis, which is not always the case, but if you find yourself in that situation, if you can leave and find another doctor who's going to treat you with the respect and dignity that you deserve, that's always the better option. And try to remember too, that you are seeing one doctor in one medical facility in the expanse of the entire country. And he may or she may have been the one to graduate at the bottom of their class, and may have been the one who didn't get the education that they needed. And there are so many other wonderful, willing medical professionals out there who will work with you. And I'm sorry, but I know it does take extra effort to go out there and find them. It's not always easy, but that unfortunately is the situation right now. It's wonderful that there are programs that are working with medical students to make sure that they get this education, so this problem becomes less and less basic and what is happening over time.
Mm-hmm. And that's so important. I think oftentimes, because the medical profession can be held to such a high esteem, and sometimes it is necessary, right? But we forget that we are paying them, right? Like we can fire our doctors, right? And I do like that idea of, if this is not serving me, I don't have to stay, and I can go somewhere else that will actually treat me like the whole person that I am, So I think that is very important. I think we have time for one or two more questions, so please keep them coming. And here I don't see any new ones, so I will go ahead and ask another question. I think another curious point for me is how do you know what to say or what not to say about your, within social health, right? So while it is important, I think, for everyone to hear rants about medical gaslighting, what is something that you would not share, or just, I guess, what is that boundary, and how do you approach it?
Sarah, do you want to jump in on this one, or do you want me to go for it?
I'll let you start, since you have the most experience with this.
Okay. So I have no boundaries. If you follow me on social media, you're going to see that I'm quite comfortable sharing pretty much everything, which is probably not the norm, but my life is an open book. And you're always going to get way more than you bargained for when when you're looking at my social channels. But it's an intentional overshare. I used to limit my social story just to, the suffering, just the really hard parts of being a patient. But my story is so much larger than that. I'm a 32-year-old rare disease patient who beat the statistics and got to adulthood. And it's not easy, but this is what it can look like. It can be, talking about my marriage or a weekend at the farmer's market or a nervous breakdown in the waiting room. And I want to give a very holistic sense of what it means to be a modern patient living in a world that maybe isn't always built for me or people like me. And representation, it's important. It's not always pretty or flattering or optimistic, but optimism isn't always the point. I think, the point is social health can really be the tool we use to obliterate isolation. And it's hard to feel lonely or shamed or hopeless when you see you're not really alone in this experience.
Sarah, did you want to add to that?
I completely agree. I mean, I think, of course, people share what they feel comfortable sharing. So like, hey, you never have to share anything that you don't feel comfortable with, right? So like, there's always going to be people like Ilana who feel really comfortable sharing things about everything. But if you only feel comfortable talking about one or two things, then that's totally fine. Like, you don't have to be someone who talks about everything, or you don't have to be someone who talks about something else just because someone else is. I think, you talk about what you feel is meaningful and people will appreciate that. And ultimately, you're always going to be helping other people and also just helping yourself. I'm sure for Ilana and others, it's really cathartic being able to talk about your experience and knowing that there's other people on the other side who have dealt with similar situations.
And I think too, we see a lot of patient leaders use pseudonyms who go online and they are sharing very personal details, but they're doing it under a name that is not theirs, so that they can have that personal privacy. Because we do see a lot of patients who are they're embarrassed and ashamed. They just want their privacy, especially when it comes to certain diseases, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Any way that you choose that makes you feel comfortable, just like Sarah said, if it helps you, if it's cathartic to you, if you feel it will be helpful to the community, then that's the right way to do it.
I also think it's important to recognize that, if you're someone who is sharing your story and you don't feel like you're getting a lot of interaction, like publicly in whatever form you're sharing that story, that doesn't mean you're not actually making a difference, because we have tons of lurkers who just really want to read and they feel less alone by hearing your story. And the more real you can be, the bigger of a difference that you're going to make. So those lurkers who aren't interacting visibly online, they're probably talking about it at the dinner table with their family or taking those conversations to the doctor's office. So much of the impact that patient leaders are making is not even something that you can see in the real world. You really have to get to know people. So I think it's hard to remember that sometimes when you see people with a ton of followers or a ton of engagement on their posts. That makes a huge difference, but you can make a difference in other ways too.
It's true. It's true. So another question that we received is, someone doesn't feel supported in their specific disease community. And the question is, should they force themselves into another space or look for support from others with different diseases? I guess, what are you guys' your takes on that approach?
I can start with this one. So one, I'm sorry you don't feel supported in your community, but there are so many other communities out there. And even if you don't have the same condition as someone else, a lot of what you go through is similar situations. So whether it's with your doctor or with health insurance or, being in public or something, I think there's a lot of overlaps in other communities. So I would say definitely look into other communities, but maybe even if you feel comfortable to start sharing and posting in that community, and maybe others will kind of follow the lead. You know, I think there's so much that people can do, even if it's just like baby steps, you know, like you don't have to have a blog or an Instagram or TikTok to be an active patient leader. You can just talk to people, talk to family members, talk to friends, kind of get the word out and feel support there. But I definitely think that speaking with other people in other communities can be just as helpful. So I would definitely give that a try.
Any other thoughts?
I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, I think there can be, I've seen it in certain communities, there can be a lot of toxicity in certain disease groups online. And one, know that it's usually bigger than just that group that you're seeing online. So if you want to kind of start your own area for that, don't be afraid to do so. And always, of course, look around and see what already exists. And then think too, like, just because your disease is one specific disease, there might be larger like categories of support. So if you have, you know, ankylosing spondylitis, you might go into the autoimmune general support groups, or if you have Parkinson's, you might go into the larger, you know, neurology support groups. So sometimes you can kind of like go up and branch out in that sense. And then of course, rare disease has just a billion different ways you can go for support in so many different groups. So if you're not finding the support you're looking for, I would say, like, don't force yourself into a space that is not supportive, because what does that do for you? That doesn't help you in any way. So find your best fit, or go out and create it.
I like that. And I also really like the approach of real life. I know that, contrary to my age, everything seems to be very much like social media, but I do think there is so much power in just having a conversation with family members, right? I know a lot of our patients, especially our patients who have children, or parents of our patients, just getting them comfortable with the fact that maybe their niece, their nephew, their grandchild is struggling with something that they've never seen before, right? It can be very helpless, right? And so sometimes that social network can actually be within your own family structure, and how building that support would be important, because they're the people you will be around more often than the people that you probably interact with on social media. So I think that is also important to make sure that people know about. We have about 3 more minutes. So again, one more question, I think. But if no other questions, I do have one. So, I mean, specifically from Ilana, it seems like, again, that onus is on the patient, right? To do all of these things. How do you support, like, where do you find support outside of, or maybe if you do find support within this, just to help you get through, right? Like, not necessarily just, okay, like I need support to validate my feelings, because they are validated, but just to continue, right? Like, outside of the realm of just being a rare patient, who just supports Ilana, and how do patients find that in general, especially if they're being thrown into these leadership positions, you know?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's funny, because it is another one of those things that support for yourself is an intentional find. You have to really go out there and figure out, like, who is going to be understanding and who's going to be, it's hard, because you're going to find people who are kind of on the fringes of what you're experiencing, and they're going to approach you with not empathy, but pity. And that's backwards for what you need often. So for me personally, one thing I cannot recommend enough is go to therapy. Therapy day and night. It's not because anything is wrong with you. It is because it is a stressful situation to be a patient with a rare disease or a chronic illness. And you do need that support. You do need that, emotional support, and you need someone to help you strategize. how you're going to micromanage all these feelings and situations and medical PTSD that you're probably going to experience. So therapy is a huge suggestion that I'd put out there. But I also have a wonderful husband. My mother is great. They're both advocates in the community as well. And then again, there are so many websites like our own health union communities. Sometimes for me, just going ahead and reading through different articles just makes me feel, again, pulls me out of that sense of isolation, makes me see that my experiences, while at times feel so stressfully unique, like nobody else is going through these things like I am going through them. Because if you're thinking about your life in just the general world, and you're looking at your neighbors, your friends, other people in your family who don't live with these challenges, you just feel extremely isolated. But if you put yourself in a different group and you look at your community, you realize people are living, like they are out there with the exact same circumstances as you, and they are finding ways, and they're having breakdowns, and that's okay too. You can have those. But knowing that these communities online, having mental health support, and then I've also just having been a patient leader in the community, I worked so much with patient leaders in every capacity. And we have, I mean, I get DMs all day back and forth where we're, just discussing everything that we're going through. And again, it's helpful because I do go on my Instagram stories all day and just like all the drama that I'm going through, I put out there so that people can see like, I'm not alone, you're not alone. And we have that dialogue. So that's been really helpful for me. It's one of the reasons I do encourage people to, if they feel comfortable with it, go on social media and share, because you can find so many people who are going through what you're going through. And I think that's one of the pillars of support that I just can't rave about enough.
No, that's important. And I guess one more slightly connected question to that, to both Kristine and Sarah, is as people who might not necessarily be struggling with a rare disease, how do you, in a sense, control your empathy, right? If you're, especially like, Sarah, you work with cystic fibrosis, and you probably are receiving, many comments or text messages or however they communicate with you about their specific conditions. How do you then control that while still giving support to them, but then also not necessarily letting the onus fall on you, if that makes sense?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Definitely there's times and comments that I'll see that I'm like, this is a lot. And as an empathetic person, I'm sure a lot of us here are empathetic people. It can be really tough, and you want to just like reach out and like hug someone, but you're on a computer, and so you can't really do that. So you kind of just like respond in a loving way, and you think about what they're going through. And I know that I can't relate on their level. So what I try and do is share resources. Maybe like there's an article that could be something similar that they're going through, or there's a forum page that, they mentioned that, like a topic that they mentioned, or a story that someone else posted. That's where I'll go in and share those forums or stories to kind of like help connect that and help fill that gap, because I know that that's what they're looking for, and that's what's really valuable. We also have patient leaders who write articles. And so sometimes I'll reach out to them if they've dealt with a similar situation, and we'll say like, hey, someone, in our community is dealing with this. I know you've gone through this. Would you be willing to just like chat with them or have a conversation? And they're more than likely to, respond and have a conversation with them. But as Kristine mentioned earlier, I definitely look at people differently and just like have more empathy for other people. And while I'm not going through everything that like, a lot of you are, I like try and, be in your shoes and try and like understand from your perspective. And I just learned so much from all of you and have so much gratitude and so much like appreciation for everything that you all do. And especially the CF community, so many caregivers and moms and dads and grandparents and spouses and everything they do. it's just incredible. So yeah, there's a lot of empathy there, and just kind of like taking it one day at a time with all of those conversations and stories going on.
I totally agree with everything that Sarah and Ilana have said already. And, you know, I think at times, you know, I'm also like a very empathetic individual, and it's heavy. There's a lot of heavy discussion. And I think whether you're someone who is actually experiencing the things that you're reading online from other patients, or if you're someone like myself who is like more of an observer but a support provider, I think everyone needs like screen breaks, to be honest. And like to echo what Ilana said, like therapy. I think everyone has heavy stuff going on, whether it's, you know, some obviously have more than others, but I think empathetic individuals especially need to make sure that they take time for themselves to fill their cup, and whatever that looks like. It could be just participating in forums that are about like fun things, or, you know, reading a book or taking a walk. I think self-care continues to be important for everyone, and breaks, especially screen breaks, are really great.
Yes, I support everything. So I just want to thank all three of you, phenomenal. And I truly enjoyed just leading this panel / fireside chat. But we're going to be turning it over to Cheyenne Walmsley.
Thank you so much, everyone. So to any of you who might just be joining this second session, I wanted to say hello and thank you all for joining at the 2022 Leap into Advocacy Virtual Summit. My name is Cheyenne Walmsley, and I am a genetic counselor and project manager for the Genomes to People Research Program, which is based at Brigham Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. And if I can summarize G2P, it's really that we conduct research that explores what I like to refer to as our 3 tenets, which is the medical, behavioral, and economic impacts that the use of genomic information has on medicine. And so through this work, I was given the opportunity to meet one of our lovely organizers, Miss Sarita Edwards, and also is the reason I had this opportunity to speak with you all today. So I'm very excited to be here. And so the title of our second session for today is Using Culturally Appropriate Resources to Influence Health Equity and Access. But before I introduce you to our panel of speakers for today's session, I really just wanted to give you a quick introduction to how my personal career in genetics relates to health equity and access. So I'm just going to share a few quick slides. Great. And hopefully you all can see that. Please give me a thumbs up if you can. So with the popularity of direct-to-consumer testing, such as 23andMe, and also this surge of interest I think we've been seeing in society at large regarding our ancestry, I really wanted to start by talking about genetic ancestry and race in genomics. As many of you may already know, race is actually a construct that's influenced by social, political, and economic factors. And in many studies, race is typically self-identified. And so what many people might not actually realize is that genetic ancestry does not determine our race and ethnicity. It's actually loosely correlated which can be estimated through genetic data, and is really more so representative of historical geography. And so in continuing with this topic of genetic the idea of race and ancestry, I also wanted to highlight some of the disparities that we see in genomic research and databases. So NOMAD referenced here is actually a resource that was developed by an international coalition of investigators to try and aggregate and kind of harmonize all of the data that we've collected from large-scale sequencing studies. And it may surprise you, or maybe not, that actually less than 10% of sequences are representative of individuals with African ancestry. And in similar fashion, we also see that in genome-wide associated studies, or studies that are really, their purpose is to help scientists identify genes that are associated with different types of diseases, are also mostly of European ancestry. So on this slide quoted at 78%. And so this lack of diversity we have seen in our own genetic studies. And so the project I'm referencing today is what we, as a pilot study that we refer back to as the Baby-Seq-1 study. And so this was a study that used genome sequencing in newborns, about 159 babies located in Boston. And we did find that about 11% of babies actually had a significant health-related finding. And one of our other findings was that there was actually no evidence to suggest that families receiving this information were upset by it, or that it significantly increased their healthcare costs. However, again, as I mentioned, this lack of diversity, almost all parents who enrolled were non-Hispanic white. And of course, there's a lot of factors that go into this. We only enrolled in Boston. This was also a project that at the time was very controversial, and also some of that controversy lingers today about whether or not we should be doing this sort of expansive testing on newborns. But if we look at the bigger picture, we also know that one, although not the cause, but one of the major causes of this lack of diversity that we see in genomics results from historical injustices that have led to mistrust in research among minorities and has greatened some of these health disparities and inequities that we see today. And so we're actually hoping to, we are doing a second iteration of the Baby-Seq study, in which we hope to enroll a more diverse cohort of families, including those who identify as Black or African American or Hispanic or Latino. And one of the very influential pieces of our study design and how we plan to do this is that we've convened a stakeholder board of 10 members with community representation from the 3 original sites that we plan to recruit from. Since then, we've actually expanded to 2 additional sites, including Philadelphia and Detroit, which is not pictured here currently. But pretty much, we met with our stakeholder board on a quarterly basis via Zoom. We do compensate them $1,000 for their time per year that they are involved in the study. And just in this first year of feedback alone, they have been very influential on many aspects of our study design, which I have summarized on my final slide. And this includes inclusion criteria, informed consent, sample collection, and cascade testing. So originally, we were going to require that 2 parents be required in order to participate in the study. But it was our stakeholder board who really emphasized the spectrum of family structures that and requiring this 2 parents to participate could really be exclusive to many families, especially with the group that we're trying to recruit. And so we actually expanded our criteria to include more babies in family structures by only requiring 1 parent or legal guardian, and almost any baby. We also had our stakeholder board revise our informed consent form, which is probably the most important document within a study, getting a study started. And this has actually been very influential to the Institutional Review Board, which is an administrative body that is responsible for protecting the rights and welfare of human research subjects. So they actually hope to use our consent form as a template for, to have more accessible language for other studies moving forward. So we were very excited to hear that. And then very quickly, to summarize our last 2 points, we did also adjust our sample to a heel stick as it was less invasive for our infants. And also we removed requirements to collect samples of our parents and also the control group, meaning babies who would be randomly assigned to the group that wouldn't receive genome sequencing in this study. We felt that if we maintained these requirements, that it would actually potentially exacerbate some of the mistrust that we know we see today. And of course, genetic testing is a family affair. We share many of our genes and DNA with our family members. And so with input from the stakeholder board, we also updated our protocol to offer optional testing for any parents and siblings of infants who are identified to have a health risk of some kind. And so thank you for allowing me some time to review some of the work I've been involved in. And of course, we have not cracked the code to resolve any and all health disparities. But this work, it's been amazing to work with the stakeholder board, and it's definitely inspires me as far as the further work we could do to continue to combat health disparities and inequities. And hopefully by the end of this session, you guys will also be inspired if you're not already. So without any further ado, I would love to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Shruti Mitkis, who is going to present on some of her work and experiences as the Director of Genetic Education and Navigation for Global Genes.
Thank you, Cheyenne. Hello, everyone. Very nice to meet you. Quick background about myself, like Cheyenne mentioned, my name is Shruti Mitkis. I am not a patient, but I'm a patient advocate. My background is in human genetics. So I got my doctorate in human genetics and have since then worked in a bunch of fields related to rare disease. I am now the Director of Genetic Education and Navigation at Global Genes. Some of you might know of Global Genes, but we are a patient advocacy organization, and our focus is on patients that live with rare disease. And so I'm going to share with you my presentation that is going to talk a little bit about using culturally appropriate resources and the impact of culture on healthcare. And before I start, I just want to, let me first share my screen with you. All right. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. I did want to start off by the disclaimer that I do not claim to be an expert in culturally appropriate talk in healthcare. I am learning, just like I'm sure a lot of us are. I'm learning a lot from my colleagues that work at Global Genes, patients that I've spoken to, had the pleasure of meeting Sarita at one of our meetings in Philadelphia and learned a tremendous amount about the patient experience and how culturally appropriate resources can impact healthcare. And so please take my slides with that little disclaimer in mind. So the title of my talk is Using Culturally Appropriate Resources to Influence Health Equity and Access. So I wanted to start off very quickly by just highlighting culture as we define it. It encompasses so much more than we might think of. So it encompasses customary beliefs, any social forms and norms that we have in how we behave, and any material traits that can either be racial, they can be religious, they can be geographical, depending on where you come from, either in a country or on the planet. And it can also be social groups that we subscribe to and belong to. And I just wanted to put this slide up here so we can get a sense of and appreciate how all-encompassing culture can be in one's outlook, not just in our day-to-day outlook on life, but also when we access healthcare. So it also includes personal identification, how we perceive ourselves and what cultural group we belong to, language, the way we think about things and how we communicate those things within our group and outside of our group. And as I mentioned before, it is a characteristic feature of our everyday existence. And so a divorce of culture from healthcare or really any other aspect of our life is not realistic, and it cannot be trivialized at all. Culture, as I said, is all encompassing. I put down here a list of the things that one generally thinks of when one thinks of one's culture. But again, this list is not exhaustive at all. Some of the key things that might impact a number of things, but particularly healthcare, could be a person's age, where they come from, how long they've lived in the country that they've lived in, their education levels, what language they speak, what their sexual orientation is, their political beliefs and how they see those beliefs being enacted out day to day. And of course, the racial and ethnic group that a person belongs to. And like Cheyenne mentioned, not just belongs to in terms of how they look or what their genetic makeup is, but what they really identify themselves in, and the group of people that share similar beliefs to them is what we refer to as their ethnic group as well. And then socioeconomic status, we cannot divorce talks of culture with understanding the socioeconomic background that a person comes from and how that influences how they view healthcare, how they access healthcare, and how their beliefs about whether they can access that healthcare, how that changes depending on their socioeconomic status. So I just wanted to give a quick flavor of all the different aspects of culture and things to keep in mind when we talk about developing culturally appropriate material. So the role of culture in healthcare. As I touched upon briefly, healthcare is not something that is not impacted by a person's belief in their cultures. It's influenced not just with our regular day-to-day beliefs in how we live and what kind of language we speak and what kind of food we enjoy eating, but also our beliefs surrounding health in general and wellness and how we see illness and disease. Do we see it as an intrinsic problem within oneself, or do we identify it as something that is a curse from a God that we might have displeased, or do we identify well-being as something that is a community affair? So our beliefs in how we look at healthcare and health information are largely driven by our cultural context and where we come from. So cultural respect of that has to have an important say, and we've done studies where we know this has a positive effect on patient care. So delivering services that are respectful of a person's background and are responsive to their health beliefs, their practices, and their cultural and linguistic needs is extremely important if we want that service to be of effect in the population that we're targeting. Cultural respect can also improve access to high quality healthcare. So the more culturally appropriate the healthcare information is, the more accessible it is to the community that one is trying to impact. We can enable organizations to function effectively, to understand the needs of the individuals that are accessing this information. And of course, it is critical to reduce these health disparities and access to unbiased quality care. So unless we have a concerted effort of developing educational material and healthcare information and clinical trials, unless we make a concerted effort to develop those using the cultural perspective of the audience that we're trying to target, the effectiveness of our material is definitely going to suffer. Cultural competence is the capability to acknowledge and respect one's individual identity, ethnicity, language, and cultural beliefs. And when I say not just acknowledge, but respecting that this is a driving force in decision making in this person, and that's something that needs to be respected. And I'll give subsequent examples of what I mean by respecting a person's culture when making decisions in healthcare. So I wanted to highlight here really quickly a couple of examples that I came across where cultural barriers limit access to healthcare. And I'm highlighting here the experience of immigrants. So immigrant patient-provider interactions suffer because there is a disconnect, not only with regard to language, but also to culture. And these are direct quotes from this news article on this paper that was published. And I've provided the source here. Everyone is welcome to read it for themselves, but essentially culture and language differences, lower socioeconomic status, and lack of knowledge seem to be key barriers in accessing healthcare within the immigrant population. And so communicating with the healthcare providers, understanding the health directive that the provider is directing the patients to, that was found to be a barrier if the language that was spoken was not the same as the patient that was accessing the care. And here it says they are hesitant to seek care. I think the authors are saying that immigrant populations in general are hesitant to seek care from Western physicians due to the experience of stereotyping by physicians. And this touches upon an important point about maybe conscious and unconscious biases that physicians may have just by looking at someone or seeing that they don't speak the same language as them. There might be some perceived biases, and the only way that one can tackle that moving forward is through education and creating resources for physicians to familiarize themselves about these biases that they may or may not have, and then address the healthcare system through that means. So lack of cultural awareness by physicians affects communication. And they are more directed with immigrant patients and deliberately withhold information based on the belief that the immigrant patients will have limited understanding. And this is what I was speaking to when I said unconscious biases. A lot of us tend to think that if someone doesn't speak the same language as us, they are somehow diminished in their capacity to understand directives as a physician or as a healthcare person. And that is certainly a bias that we have to address, because judging someone on their linguistic style and the language they choose to speak in and how that impacts their healthcare should not be one of the things that patients have to deal with. Another study or another article that I read recently, and I wanted to highlight here just to talk a little bit about the inequities that certain populations that are underserved, like in this case, Black women, the kind of inequities that they face. So this was a poster that was presented at the American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting this past spring. And it talked about how the majority of Black women with metastatic breast cancer don't get enrolled into research clinical trials. Only 40% of Black respondents said that they were even offered a trial. And the author of this poster made the comment that nobody even talks to us about clinical trials. And this highlights the need to understand what the bias is or what the barriers are in accessing care, particularly when it comes to race or socioeconomic standing. The fact that physicians or research centers are not even offering clinical trials to patients, perhaps based solely on their race, is something that's alarming, and is definitely more work needs to be done to educate physicians and healthcare providers and researchers, and really figure out what is the reason that is causing this barrier for accessing clinical trial care. This also impacts care moving forward, and mortality and morbidity rates in patients, not just in cancer, but in wide range of disorders, including rare diseases, which is what Global Genes focuses on. So the purpose of this slide was to highlight in your mind how pervasive it is that health inequity that doesn't take into account cultural sensitivity, how it can have widespread ramifications in a number of disease areas. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the graphic on the left. This is the famous Dahlgren and Whitehead's model of determinants of population health. And I put this here just to highlight that if you see in this graphic, general socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions are sort of all encompassing. They not only are a huge driver in population health, but also an individual accessing healthcare resources. So one cannot divorce socioeconomic cultural impacts from an individual who is right here at the heart of things, and their lifestyle choices that then impacts their healthcare. And so the goal of effective health education programs as we're designing them, they have to be multifaceted. And here's a neat little Venn diagram that shows the content of our programs has to be patient-centered. It has to be respectful of health literacy of the population that we're targeting, and not be so full of jargon or difficult to understand words that have no meaning for a patient who just wants to understand what is the disease that they are dealing with. So cultural targeting, as I mentioned previously, cultural competence, which is making sure that healthcare staff in one's organization are aware of the cultural biases that they might have and the barriers that certain underserved populations may face when accessing care. And the underserved needs of certain populations. They might be populations that are underserved due to racial differences, due to socioeconomic differences, their immigration status, educational levels, all of those. And so where all of those intersect is what would make a highly effective health education program. And as you can see, cultural competence is one of the key drivers of that. So what are the results of having a culturally competent program? There have been widespread studies, and I won't dwell on this too much, but studies have shown that improved patient outcomes are a definite consequence of creating culturally competent resources for patients. So here are a couple of examples that I put here. After a medical center introduced a bilingual Russian internist to help resolve language barriers, Russian-speaking patients with diabetes experienced significant reduction in their blood pressure and cholesterol, because not only is the doctor, the physician, the nurses, the healthcare people, not only do they speak the language that you're familiar with, but they understand your culture and where you come from and your belief systems. And I also just wanted to point out, language, as I say, is for spoken language, but it can also be a linguistic barrier. It can also be someone who cannot speak, and we need to be considerate of having sign language interpreters that are easily available that can do American Sign Language. And so that's a nuance of language that I just wanted to highlight here. In another study, an inpatient psychiatric unit that incorporated Spanish language proverbs into their therapy session found increased participation and improved motivation and greater willingness to explore emotional topics among their Spanish-speaking patients. So once again, not just having someone who's learned Spanish, but being able to incorporate things that people use in their daily lives, like proverbs and idioms that might be specific to that population. That makes, in this case, therapy, but it can be applied to other healthcare situations. That makes that content that much more meaningful to the patient that one is speaking to. Increased patient safety is a widespread consequence of culturally competent materials and training. This is in the I'm highlighting this in the setting of a hospital. So there have been numerous studies and meta-analyses that show that in the absence of culturally competent care, preventable mistakes can happen and adverse events can happen. And that can be due to lack of being able to communicate clearly with the patient because of linguistic barriers, unable to explain the medication levels and the adherence protocol to patients because one is not sensitive to the education level of the patient that one is talking to. And there are many, many examples of how patient safety can be impacted if one is not clearly communicating to patients in a culturally sensitive manner. And of course, increased efficacy and adherence to treatment. So like I mentioned before, if we're not able to clearly communicate to our patients or our patient groups and caregivers, if we're not clearly able to communicate how a medication should be taken, why it's being taken, what is the importance of screening for common or rare health conditions, then it's more than likely that patients will not adhere to their treatment protocols. So a PLOS One review found that Black men rated providers' behaviors and attitudes more positively after the clinic gave its providers cultural competence training. So clearly the outcome was a general feeling of a better healthcare in patients that access this information through this clinic. In addition to raising patient satisfaction, it also increases the likelihood that the patient will follow the medical advice because they understand the importance and they understand culturally, if it's explained to them, they understand culturally why it's important for them to follow this medical advice. Reduce care disparities. As I had mentioned earlier, one of the barriers that among the many, many barriers that people can face is accessibility. So ensuring that language and culture and race and other factors, they don't become barriers in patients receiving quality care. There have been recent studies that have shown that depending on one's racial background and one's racial makeup, the amount of time it takes to see a healthcare provider is significantly higher for Black, African American, and Hispanic patients compared to Caucasians. The amount of time it takes for patients to see, not just see their internist, but to see a specialist takes longer. And that might be because there might be medical gaslighting, like we heard earlier, where symptoms are not taken seriously, or they're not taken seriously or understood because there's a linguistic barrier. So it all kind of ties in together in terms of language and accessibility. And of course, decreased financial costs for patients and healthcare providers. So if we make the healthcare more accessible and we make it such that it is targeted for people that we are trying to care for, the likelihood is that our patients will adhere to the directive of the medical doctors. They will take their medications when they need to. They will have health screenings. They will take better care of themselves. And that will ultimately lead to a reduced financial cost for patients because it will not lead to more and more problems accumulating. And also for healthcare providers, if we have culturally competent training for all healthcare providers, it reduces miscommunication, it reduces misdiagnoses, it reduces errors that can happen in medical care that can also add to the economic burden of the disease and ultimately affect the healthcare provider's office as well. I just wanted to touch upon the barriers to healthcare very quickly. I already spoke about linguistic differences. According to the 2020 US Census, almost 67 million people speak a language other than English at home. And so that's a large chunk of people that might not feel comfortable accessing all healthcare information in English. And so language can be a critical barrier in treatment and preventative care. Socioeconomic status, if one has limited or no health insurance, it can be the costs of treatment and the costs of diagnosis can be prohibitive. And so being being familiar with that and sensitive to the socioeconomic status of the community one is serving is important. I touched upon immigration status earlier, but Latinx immigrants and mixed immigration status families face many more health inequities and barriers, not just language, including prejudice, discrimination based on their immigration status, and then fear of deportation, which is very real for a lot of people, and it impacts how they interact with their healthcare team, if they interact at all, and if they want to just stay under the radar, as it were. Sexual orientation studies have shown that women in same-sex relationships found to have significantly less health insurance coverage. They were less likely to have preventative care, and they were more likely to report unmet medical needs. And so that is an important chunk of the population that we need to be culturally sensitive to and understand what their unique barriers are. And there have been tons and tons of data on how race and ethnicity impacts healthcare and disparities in health access, and as well as health outcomes, so mortality, morbidity, amount of time to diagnosis between white Americans and people of color. And I've also just left links here for you all to access at your time, but these are either scientific publications or reputable websites that we can use as good resources if we wanted to understand a little bit more about these additional barriers. How can we improve cultural competence? So of course, that's the million-dollar question. Some of the ways I've listed here, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but build teams of healthcare professionals that reflect the diversity of the patient populations that we're serving. So if a patient sees that their doctor, their geneticist, their counselor, they look like them, or they understand their language and their culture, they're more likely to listen to what one is saying and to understand the information that one is providing. And so building teams really that are diverse, and not just racially diverse, but diverse in all of these points that I've mentioned here. Increasing provider training to respond with empathy to the unique cultural needs of patients. So just because a patient is deemed to not speak your language or not have the same education level as you, that a lack of empathy when responding to care for these patients is something that is really something we need to educate physicians on. I've talked about language accessibility, reducing these linguistic barriers, be it training more staff in the various languages that are spoken, hiring staff from those cultures, having a sign language interpreter available, things like that. Recognizing that individuals are unique and one cannot predict their behavior and attitudes simply based on their cultural backgrounds. And that, what I'm trying to say here is that we cannot judge a person just by looking at them and their culture. We cannot predict that this is how they will, their behavior will play out just because they come from a certain background. Everyone is unique. And so respecting the fact that an individual's choice might not be similar to their cultural background. Respecting a patient's choice based on their culture or religion. We have to be respectful of when a patient denies care as well. It's their right. But I think understanding the reason they deny care might be an important step to understand how we can prevent that barrier. So what I mean by that is if a patient comes in where their religious or cultural beliefs prevents them from a certain treatment, say a Jehovah's Witness patient who doesn't want to have a blood transfusion, it is imperative that doctors don't try to railroad them into having treatment that goes against their cultural beliefs, but work with them to see what is preventing them to have care. And then at the end of the day, if they do not want to have care, that's completely their decision. Improve patient health literacy by developing culturally appropriate educational material. And this is also imperative because a lot of the material that is either online or in textbooks is not diverse at all. It doesn't show racially distinct ethnic groups, people with different disabilities, if one doesn't see that in the education material that one is accessing, the likelihood of really paying attention to that and listening to that and educating oneself with that material goes down tremendously. I won't spend too much time going down this list, but here's another list of ways that healthcare facilities and companies can increase cultural competency. The last point I think needs to be highlighted, that an organizational cultural shift is what's needed. And so that one focuses on the person and not the disease or the ethnicity that the person comes from. I wanted to provide some concrete resources for everyone where they can access some cultural information in healthcare. So at your leisure, if you'd like to check out any of these resources, I think all of them are excellent ways to increase proficiency in cultural, developing culturally competent educational material. And why, and these resources also talk about why it's important to even bother developing culturally and linguistically competent material. Because I represent Global Genes, which is a rare disease patient advocacy organization, I did want to touch upon very quickly health equity and rare disease. So patients with rare disease, particularly those of color, have additional barriers on top of all the other barriers that we talked about. There's a significant delay in a timely diagnosis, and it is significantly longer than people of other races. There's reduced access to genetic testing, and that comes hand in hand with reduced availability of culturally competent genetic education resources. And as we saw earlier, patients that from the metastatic cancer point of view translates to rare disease as well. They're less likely to be offered and to enroll in clinical trials. And of course, this is by no means all the barriers that rare disease patients face, but just to give you a flavor of additional barriers that these patients face. And so the ways to address these is to create culturally appropriate educational material, which is one of the initiatives that Global Genes is doing currently, making culturally appropriate genetic education and family history material available for Black and Hispanic communities so they can understand the importance of it. Efforts to increase trust in medical professionals based on history and things we've seen in the past. There is a lack of trust in medical professionals. And so accessing healthcare through people that might be community leaders or patient leaders that patients trust is important. Education of healthcare providers, like I've said all throughout, increased access to virtual appointments, which can help people who are of a lower socioeconomic background that can't afford to go get into a taxi and go to the hospital to meet their appointments. Increased opportunity and access to enroll in clinical trials and even being talked to about trials that are available. Greater funding, of course, for research and treatment of rare disease that predominantly affect people of color. So specific rare diseases like sarcoidosis or sickle cell disease, which might be predominantly affecting people of color. More funding for those kind of diseases needs to be allocated. And then creation and support of centers of excellence that are exclusively or not exclusively, but targeted towards the care of underserved populations that are living with rare disease would be a key way to reduce this barrier to care that a lot of patients of color with rare disease face. So finally, I just wanted to finally end with saying that a person should always receive quality healthcare, regardless of where they come from, what they look like, how they identify, any of those factors. And a lot of work needs to be done to identify cultural barriers and then to address those barriers so that there's equitable inclusion of people from diverse backgrounds in accessing care and treatment, so we can reduce the morbidity and mortality of a large number of diseases, particularly rare diseases. And I will end with that.
So I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Mickes, for that honestly amazing, just like chef's kiss presentation. It was beautiful. I think we can all appreciate the amount of effort that you put into not just defining what culture and cultural competence is, but really, you know, how to act on them. So I really appreciate the amount of effort you put into those slides. So thank you. So at this point in time, we are going to take a 15-minute break. And when we resume, we will jump into our panel discussion. So please take this time to stretch, take a bathroom break, grab some water, and we will see you all soon. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I hope you've all been able to make it back to your seats. So I'd like to again welcome back Dr. Mickes and also introduce our two additional panel speakers for this afternoon, which includes Louisa Leal, who is the founder of the Akari Foundation, as well as my personal colleague, Bethany Zettler, who is a senior genetic counselor and project manager for Genomes to People. Would any of you like to give another statement to introduce yourselves before we get started? Okay, so Dr. Mickes, I just have a lot of questions in my mind regarding your presentation that I think would be a great place to start in this panel discussion. One of the challenges that you identified that we face in providing equitable care is implicit or unconscious bias. And also some of the ways, you know, that some of the steps we can take to either individually or even as an institution kind of overcome those and improve cultural and competence and humility. I think something that we often encounter in thinking about implicit bias is people often want to deny that they have any biases. And, you know, a statement I think I've heard a lot in some of the heated sort of discussions that have been going on the last few years, for example, is a statement like, I don't see color. How do you respond to a statement like that?
That's a great question, Cheyenne. And please, please call me Shruti. Dr. Mickes.
I actually can't hear your audio.
Oh,
is that just me? Oh, sorry.
Can everyone hear
That
me?
was me. I apologize.
Okay. Okay, no worries. I was just gonna say, well, I was first saying that please just call me Shruti, Dr. Mickes, so formal. That's a great question. So I think the number one thing is to first recognize that not all of us, regardless of where we come from and what our backgrounds are, none of us are perfect, right? We always have something to learn, and to not even acknowledge that there might be some biases that I might have, despite how, you know, open and how I think I perceive myself as not having a bias. So I think if someone says, I don't see color, or I don't see race, or whatever else they don't see, I think that's a moment to just stop and say, ask more questions, like, what do you mean by that? Because they might interpret that as something completely different, that I don't see race versus someone else. And so I think the way I would approach it is turn it back and ask them to clarify, what do you mean by that? There's nothing wrong with seeing race. We're different, you know, I'm a different race than you, and there's nothing wrong with seeing race. It's when we then start to associate certain beliefs or assume a person from a certain race will behave a certain way, or their understanding of a topic is somehow diminished because they're from a race. That's the challenge there. And so the short way that I would deal with it is really ask the person to expand on what they mean by I don't see race. And then and the broad context of that is everyone can benefit from cultural training, regardless of how good one thinks one is in their implicit or explicit biases that they might have. You're still on mute, Cheyenne.
My apologies. I'll get the hang of this. Thank you. Yeah, no, Shruti, I think you're definitely right. I think, right, one of the biggest ways to combat implicit bias, right, is being able to talk about it and creating those opportunities to explore, why we feel that way, and normalizing, right, these conversations about the fact that we all have biases, and what we can do to resolve them. Another challenge you also I think pointed out a few times in your presentation had to do with language as a barrier. And so I actually wanted to ask you, Louisa, because I know a lot of your work is providing resources in other languages, particularly in Spanish. I was hoping you could give us more context as to how translation might be more difficult than people think, and what is it that people might not quite understand about the complexity behind more than just translating something into Spanish.
Sure. What you were just mentioning, Dr. Shutri, about you don't see race, you don't see color. Oh, well, I'm sorry, someone else. But I can think of that. Like, it doesn't cross to my mind how I'm not able to see that, because I'm Hispanic and I've been through all that stuff, it's hard for me not to see there's more than just certain race, but on with your question, Shan, it haven't been easy. When I started the organization 5 years ago, I started focusing in translations, and it was taking me weeks to translate just a little content like this, because it wasn't just copy and paste on Google Translator. It was more than that. It has to have a meaning, because Hispanics, we come from a lot of different cultures and different languages. Even though we all speak Spanish in some way, we have different meanings, so I have to make a translation where it makes sense to a lot of different cultures. So it was very hard for me. Even though we had a conversation with my team, I think it was like a couple of weeks ago, we were doing this translation, and it was just one little word, one little sentence, the meaning of fill out something, right? A paper or something. And we have different, I have someone from Argentina, Colombia, the south of Mexico, and I'm from the north of Mexico. And we were trying to get, translate one little word, and we all came with 4 different meanings. And it was like, this means this in our country, this means so, it's more than just a translation, especially when it's something medical. You have to be extra careful on how do we translate. I'm lucky enough that I have someone with a medical background in translations in our team, because, we couldn't I wouldn't feel comfortable of being just sharing information. I have seen where families, just copy and paste, and I asked them, because I noticed this person in particular start posting all this, and I was like, where are you getting all that information? Because we don't even have access to that information, She's like, oh, I'm just copy and paste. I was like, no wonder, So when I created a nonprofit, like I said, it was for translations, and I realized really soon that it was more than just translating. It was more about the culture. I love every single thing that you mentioned, Dr. Shutri, because you pretty much mention everything that I have to say here. I'm done, bye. But yeah, no, you pretty much, put the nail on the coffin.
Yeah. Can I just piggyback on that real quick, what you said, Louisa? And that reminded me of, relying on Google Translate to make your Spanish language content. Big mistake, right? So the cultural nuance and what you said about how the Spanish spoken in Spain is different from the Spanish spoken in Mexico, right? Mm-hmm. And it reminded me also of a story that I read, which is very unfortunate, but I thought I'd highlight it here, is that a young man presented to the paramedics with symptoms of feeling very unwell, and he passed out. But right before he passed out, this was in Miami, so he only spoke Spanish, and right before he passed out, he said some words that had the word intoxicado in them, And the paramedic, right?
I
Paramedic,
see where you're going for.
yeah, yeah. So the paramedic who spoke broken Spanish assumed that he was intoxicated and was probably ODing and treated him accordingly. Turns out the young man had a brain hemorrhage that they didn't know about at the time, which negatively affected his health down the road tremendously. But that word intoxicado, what he meant was, which can also have the meaning of feeling sick to your stomach and feeling nauseated, which is one of the symptoms of a brain bleed. And so and he ended up, paralyzed from that brain bleed, and it led to a $71 million lawsuit with the hospital. But that being aside, that just tells you nuances where we sometimes think we know that a word because it sounds a little bit like the same word in English, and what a huge impact that can have on a person's health and downstream. I just wanted to highlight that it's not just about hiring a few people that have a little bit of training in Spanish, say. It's about that holistic approach of culture and the nuance of when I say this, it sort of means that. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yes, yeah. And like you said, I got from the beginning, like a lot of people told me, why don't you just join another organization to translate? One of those big organizations that are already out there. And I told them since the beginning, this is just more than a translation. It's cultural, and then on top of that, add the immigration part and the shock of transition from one country to another, that we're afraid of. It's a lot. It's bigger than that. I'm sorry. I'm just going through a different direction, but yeah, it's so much than that.
Yeah, it really highlights the importance of services that we take for granted, such as interpreter services. I know in my short time as a genetic counselor, it can be really difficult to access some of those services. And, it leads me to think about, generally in what other ways, I know a big part of the summit is also focused on digital health. Which is something, I think it's a future we were always, going towards, but COVID certainly kind of sped up that process. So Bethany, I wanted to direct this question to you just to give you an opportunity to talk as well. But what other ways do you think, going towards this future of digital health might, exacerbate or improve some of the health equity and access?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Cheyenne. I can just speak from my small corner of the world in genetics practice and in genetics research. We have pivoted towards telemedicine since the COVID pandemic and see almost all of our patients virtually now, which, for some people is great. For people with maybe mobility issues, it's really nice for them to not have to come into the office. It can be cost saving for some people. But at the same time, it's making a huge assumption that patients have access to, high-speed internet and a device to actually contact, the doctor and the genetic counselor. So I think in some ways we're just missing a huge swath of the population, especially the rural population who could benefit from, shorter travel distances, but might not have that infrastructure of the high-speed internet. So, it's definitely a challenge in clinical practice. And then in research, we are trying to reach more community-based healthcare clinics, and we're really trying to expand access as much as possible by having things available like texting communication versus email or phone calls, having apps on the smartphone to fill out surveys, really just creating as many resources as possible, videos you could watch on a smartphone. And for some clinics, like in Boston, they're like, this is awesome. Our patients are going to love this. And then from one of our clinics in Birmingham, Alabama, they're like, no one is going to be able to use this. So it's definitely, we're just trying to create as many options as possible to include as many people as possible. But I do think digital health is, kind of a double-edged sword in that way, that it is really beneficial to some people and, really leaving other people behind, unfortunately.
Yeah, one of the options I know we've come across in our study that we're working on together is I know I think a clinician had recommended texting, and the idea of like texting a patient is something that never would have occurred to me before. But when I think about my personal life, I don't always answer calls, especially ones I don't know, and I'm definitely more likely to at least read the text, even if maybe I don't respond to it, right? So certainly, thank you. Shruti or Louisa, do you have anything else you'd like to expand on in regards to digital health? And
in our case, we noticed that we've been trying to reach to the families. And my background is in marketing, so I'm like very about push social media, and then the families start reaching out through Facebook and Instagram, but then TikTok happened, so people are reaching out through TikTok now. But we were having a hard time to people to reach out to us. It was just through like the message under the post and stuff like that. So I decided to get an additional phone and just use it for the WhatsApp messages. And that's how we got, a lot of the families to reach out to us. What we notice is that the Hispanic population use a lot WhatsApp, and we noticed that after each webinar that we had, that's when we start getting all these messages, So at the beginning, I was answering every single message, but it was crazy because people do not understand that people have a personal life as well. And I have kids. So, they were texting at any time, any day. And then like, hello. Like, it's midnight here, So I just, basically put a little automatic message. We will reach out to you Monday through Friday, 9 to 6. And even though we work after hours, but, and then a reply with a link to a survey. So whoever answered the survey, that's the people that we reach out. Because like I said, before we were back and forth on messages and we couldn't get into nothing in a specific. So now that they fill up the form and we ask, what is your request? What do you need? And that is a lot easier for us. And then Caro, which is our assistant, she goes through all the messages and said, I can handle this, you can handle that. So we send it to different people in the organization. Well, it's only 4 of us, but and then Maria, our director of social services, she mostly handle all of them, so if they need help with information on clinical trials, or they need a wheelchair and we don't have the funds for that, but there's another organization who does, we try to accommodate them like that. So yeah, I mean, WhatsApp has been really, really helpful for us.
I just wanted to add to that, to what Bethany and Louisa said, for what they call these care deserts, right? Where, deep rural places or places, because of the financial burden of it, not having internet service or a smartphone or whatever, these care deserts that are now we've identified, I think the way to reach them is really through grassroots community organizations, people going door to door with flyers and things like that. But then that also brings up the fact of trust in the community services and the community organizations. These kind of strategies will work efficiently and will be helpful if the people that you're serving trust the community centers and trust that people knocking on their doors are not just, random people that they ignore. So I think digital health, of course, maybe for the majority of people will work very well, including telehealth and all that entails, WhatsApp and things like that. But I don't think we can trivialize the impact and the need for grassroots, community health workers going door to door and educating people.
Yeah, it's one thing to create resources. It's another thinking about how do our participants or patients actually access them. So I'd love to get some more thoughts on thinking about, in what ways might individuals access some of these resources, and what might be the best way to get it to them.
I can start the discussion off a little bit. Based on my work with Global Genes, we have an initiative that we're working on with Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, where we're creating print and social content to educate people, particularly people of color, on the importance of talking to your family history. Why should you know that, and how will that impact your health? And so we have found it to be challenging for Black people, for Hispanic people, to really access that care, that information. Let me rephrase it. We found it challenging to find places where there are trusted resources for those communities. And after having talked to a bunch of people and understanding the problem, it seems that community clinics that are run in those communities, as well as faith-based organizations, so churches and, Catholic Archdiocese or, the Baptist churches in those areas are trusted sources. And so if we can distribute our educational material or our campaigns through those kind of resources where people come, they trust, my pastor is telling me this, that it's important for me to talk to my family about this and that. I think those are good ways to really have people access care through these trusted places. And I just wanted to also just touch upon really quickly that Global Genes has a, in my mind, very unique and service called the Rare Concierge Service, and you can access that through Global Genes' website, where an individual who has access to technology, unfortunately, can fill out a form and get their specific question answered about rare disease, genetics, clinical trials, treatments, or just, can you connect me with someone else in the world who has my disease, right? Especially for some of these ultra rare diseases, or just someone to offer emotional support. You can fill out this form and put in your question, or not even a question, just say what you're feeling at the moment, and a patient services guide will answer that question and link you to other foundations and organizations, or answer your questions about clinical trials or genetic testing and things like that. So I just wanted to put it out there that this is a great resource, particularly for the rare disease community, to get their specific questions answered. And I'm not quite aware of other large advocacy organizations that also do that. So,
and that's exactly what we do, but 100% in Spanish. Because we have a psychologist on staff, and then we have our ambassador program for, it's this basically what we call a veteran parent who they've been through this deal with the disease for more than 5-6 years. And we try to connect them with newly diagnosed families, so that, give them that support that they need. And if they need extra help, we have the psychologist. And then, like I said earlier, they fill out the form and we contact them. The director of family services contact them and ask exactly what they need. They go through what they need and everything. So it's been helping a lot. I think we've been able to connect more with the families that way, and it help us to have a more structure than we had before, about, a little paper here, a little paper there, an email here, an email there, tag you here, tag you there. It was just all over. Yeah. So now it's been helping us. I think we have a better system now, and we're still working in a more complex system, but it will be a lot easier at the end. So yeah, we're waiting on new software there.
Thank you for informing us of those resources. I definitely have to check them out myself. I think they'd be a great addition to definitely some of the work Bethany and I have been doing as well. But I know we also mentioned I believe there's some mention of like trusted leaders that some of our patients or participants might look to. Shruti, I believe you said like church leaders for those who might, follow a faith of some sort. And I think a lot of how we learn about some of these resources and, who do our patients or participants trust is through, some of the work that Bethany and I are trying to do, such as stakeholder engagement in our Baby Seat project. And so Bethany, you probably could have already could tell I was getting ready to pivot to you, but I'd love to hear more about your experience and how it's been to convene a stakeholder board and maybe some of the lessons learned and the challenges faced.
Yeah, thank you. And you could probably speak to this just as well as I can. I know you've done a ton of this work, but it has been really great getting our board together. So we actually don't have any faith-based leaders on our board, but we do have, we're recruiting infants from this study. And so we do have a couple of midwives who are familiar with delivering babies within the community. We have a couple of former research participants who can use their experience to inform our practices. A couple of people involved in like early childhood education. So really nice perspectives that have been super helpful. And Cheyenne, you mentioned a couple of ways that this board has helped to shape our study. I think one key that has helped with our relative success so far is that we engaged with our stakeholders super early. So actually, as soon as we were writing the NIH grant submission, so actually asking the government for funding, in that initial submission, we actually got letters from about 12 different community stakeholders. So we got their buy-in and they were willing to actually write a letter saying that they supported this work and would be involved. So that was really awesome. And I think this was actually the third time we had asked for funding. So I think that engagement actually really helped get our grant over the edge and actually get us money to do it, which is awesome. And that was about 1.5 years before we even started planning the study. So I'm really hopeful that the NIH will continue to recognize that that is a really important part of study design, and that will be a continued part of the policy and funding. And since then, it really has been a partnership. A lot of our actual research investigators have been in this field for 30, 40 years and are pretty set in their ways. And so I think that's where, kind of intermediaries like Cheyenne and I are really helpful to listen to the stakeholder board and, translate those ideas a little bit into actual research recommendations. And one specific study design recommendation actually took a ton of communication, a ton of literature review for me and Cheyenne, a ton of, discussions with the team, special meetings with the investigators. But eventually we were able to implement the stakeholder recommendation in that case. So I think it is a lot of, communication. It's not something that is, it hasn't really been an expectation in the past, but I really think going forward, I'm really hopeful that research does include that more and more.
Thank you, Bethany. And just with these last 2 minutes we have, and of course, any of the three of you comment on this, but thinking about, we were talking about health disparities, and of course, with that comes inclusion. But I also think about the opposite end, where in trying to include more diverse patients, participants, sometimes the darker side of trying to do that leads more to targeting rather than, for our own personal gain rather than for their own. So what is some of the ways that we can try to avoid tokenizing some of these underrepresented minorities? I'd love any thoughts on that.
Sure, that's an excellent point you bring up, Cheyenne. Certainly one doesn't want to be, feel like, as a community being targeted. I think it all really boils down to, one, again, how much trust and reputation you have in the community in terms of your intentions. Are you just going in there and seeing, what you can get from the initiative that you're doing? So I think building trust in the community is important. And then how you gear your material and how you message that is super important, I think. Because if it's, there's a nuance between the way you say it and does it make someone feel targeted, or is it truly because you think this community is underserved, it can really value from the initiatives and campaigns and education materials that you're creating, or whatever else that'll impact their healthcare. And then, like Bethany mentioned, getting buy-ins from different stakeholders that have possibly already established connections within these communities. And so again, building that trust that we're not doing this for our own benefit, but a benefit that we think will have a larger community impact. Yeah.
Okay, so I know we're a bit over time, so that's probably all we have for this session. But I wanted to thank all of our panel speakers for all the work that you do, of course, and also for taking the time to discuss this really important topic on health equity and access and with our audience. So thank you. And I will now turn it over to our moderator for the third session of the day, Ms. Zerkowski Edwards.
So this session, we are actually talking about leveraging digital concepts to advance accessibility. We've had a lot of conversation about digital health just in the last session. We'll probably touch on that a little more in our panel discussion. I wanted to go ahead and start the session with Nikki Bonet. She's going to talk a little bit about navigating through the future of digital health. So we'll turn it over to her, and then we'll hear from Kristine Van Rasveld, and then we'll come back together for a fire chat. So Nikki, it is all yours.
All righty. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nikki Bonet. I'm going to be talking a little bit today in terms of what is coming in advancements for patient accessibility, at least from the perspective of technology. Don't worry, I did realize that I was coming in late in this session, so we will keep things high level so they're very easily able to be understood, as well as kind of keeping you folks engaged. I didn't want to go ahead and lull everyone into a nice afternoon nap, if you will. So we're going to focus on 3 key areas, and those are where we are today, and also my predictions for what is on the horizon, and the 4 pillars of technology that is really driving us to push the art of what is possible. Now, before we take a look into the future state of possibilities, I think it's really important for us to take a step back to gain perspective on the bigger picture. Historically speaking, the term digital health really experienced its genesis a little over a decade ago. And it's really hard to believe that the pioneers of innovation had this realization that mobile devices and tablets were going to radically change how we thought about healthcare. And there are certainly many challenges that impede the natural evolution of tech innovation. And by and large, the biggest obstacle faced is resource management, with 95% of IT decision makers struggling to find enough time to balance between their day-to-day task along with finding time to work on innovation projects. And certainly no surprise here, a close second with 60% was identifying and remediating security risk. The level of sophistication and scale of these cyber attacks that we have been experiencing has grown exponentially over the last 5 years. Now, something that did give me great hope is the fact that accelerating remote patient monitoring and telehealth was actually on this list. And as you can see there at the bottom, that's with 43% of IT decision makers. So we are striving in the right direction. So At the foundational level of patient access, we are looking at solutions such as telehealth, remote patient monitoring, along with what I am coining the remote health 2.0. And really, when I think about these categorically, I would classify the last two with having more of a focus on easier access in order to have earlier interventions to enable us to have better patient outcomes. Now, digital health had a standout year in 2021 with startups raising an eye-popping $29.1 billion. And to help put that into perspective for everyone, that was $15 billion more than the previous year. So I can say one thing for COVID in terms of a silver lining. Really what happened with having COVID come into all of our lives was it accelerated the acceptance of using telehealth. And a poll revealed that 73% of users anticipated to continue using telehealth services or to actually increase its usage in the near future. And two areas that received a massive boost in funding that is worth noting was diabetes and also musculoskeletal care, which both of those are becoming much easier to manage in virtual settings. Now, when I was doing my research, one company that really stood out to me was Hinge Health. And they offer a platform for completely having virtual physical therapy. And if you stop to think about that for a moment, you'll realize just how innovative that really is. I mean, essentially, this eliminates travel time to go to your appointments. Patients don't have to worry about the astronomical cost of gas. Along with the fact that you're not having to take time off of work or wasting any of your precious time sitting around in a crowded waiting room. In my opinion, this is truly a win-win for us and the epitome of what patient access in the future could look like. So what is actually propelling us forward into this future state of accessibility? So essentially, there are four driving forces that are really underpinning these improvements. And those are improvements in our chips and processors, the amount of power that is coming out of these tiny devices is astounding. Second to that, we are experiencing this time where we are having greater connectivity in our infrastructure, and that is being driven more by 5G. And then thirdly, we have the proliferation and wide adoption of usage of the Internet of Things. So thinking about your wearables and your, Apple Watch and those types of things are kind of being more and more accepted and adapted and also integrated into other applications. And then lastly, we are talking about edge computing. That's a big one. And essentially what that means is that the data that is being captured on the device is also being processed there, which allows us to have near real-time data insights, which is incredibly powerful when we are talking about healthcare. So I know that you're probably thinking, what do we have to look forward to in the future? And a promising new technology that we do have is something that has evolved from machine learning AI. And that is the concept of using a digital twin in both healthcare settings and clinical trials. And I'm sure most of you are kind of wondering, what is a digital twin? And that's essentially a digital version of you. And I rest assured, this is not a technology that is exclusively used in healthcare. Matter of fact, it's being used in other industries, particularly in manufacturing, and has received wide adoption. So your digital twin is the concept of all of your health data. So compromise of all of your health data. Think of your data points like baseline, vital readings, your demographics, allergies, and the likes. And this technology really shows great promise, particularly for the life sciences. It can be used as another proof point to meet the endpoints in clinical trials, which will enable to accelerate the bringing of new treatments to market at a faster rate. But to kind of level set expectations, this is something that is very forward thinking. And I do believe that we are probably realistically a good 5 to 10 years out before we see this as the norm and being accepted. So all of these facets of technology bring us tremendous potential in how we bring about new models of healthcare treatments. And just like a famous superhero once stated, with great power also comes great responsibility. So with these new advancements, we're going to have to consider things that are not always top priority in tech innovation, such as ethics, and also looking at things such as data privacy. So in conclusion, for us to solidify this new future, this is really going to take an all hands on deck strategy and for all of us to be involved. And with that, I thank you all for sitting through.
All right, I hope that you all can hear me. I'm at a conference. I've tried to find a little area somewhere on the side, but I want to say thank you to Nikki for really bringing up some of those points. And I don't have slides. I prefer not to. I'd like to talk and interact. So if you guys have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. I'm not sure I'll see them, but I'm sure Sarita will. My name is Kristine von Rayfeld. I founded a small nonprofit called People with Empathy. And I have multiple autoimmune and rare disease conditions. I'm still on a diagnosis journey of really trying to figure out where I am, but I'm getting closer. Anyways, I started my journey really long ago. My surgery was at 5, and my health history has been kind of a nightmare. I've never been interested in science or anything like science. School was not my forte until the most recent years, when I finally realized how science, sorry for the background noise, how science could actually improve my own life and improve the quality of my life. A few years ago, I was walking with a walker. Periods of time I was in a wheelchair and really just confused about where I was. I felt like a burden on society and just really felt like, you know, I didn't have any value. And all that changed when I started to really just dig deeper into my own life and what I had to offer. So I started with a program which you all know is 23andMe now, and it was 23andMe back then, but it was really geared towards the lupus study. And it really sparked my interest in that clinical side of the disease, why this was happening. No one else in my family really had any symptoms, so I wanted to know. From there, I went from 23andMe. I found a program at my local hospital. Luckily enough, I grew up in Silicon Valley, so I'm near Stanford Hospital. And I was able to get into a program called the Human-Wide Program. And what that basically did was showing patients, or really trying to build a program to see how much patients could monitor themselves at home and interact with their own care. And so a lot came out of that. I had a pharmacogenomics test, which really changed the way my treatment is issued now. And in California, there's actually a Senate bill to make that available to all Medi-Cal patients. So really moving forward on that. But from there, I joined Patients Like Me. And like Nikki said, the idea for me of this digital twin was introduced. And to me, and I don't know if you all think about it this way, but I thought of this as, I've gone through a lot of damage from medications. I have 3 joint replacements. I have toxic encephalopathy. I've lost some night vision. My idea of a digital twin was this person that lives on the internet or on the web or wherever you want to say they live, who was then able to take these medications forward. That physical Kristine and physical me didn't have to deal with all of those side effects and dealing with, you know, the emotional roller coaster that goes along with trying those. So I've really been an advocate since, you know, Patients Like Me, which you know, Digital Me program has since halted, but so many other initiatives out there. Now I'm part of the All of Us research program. I've been on their virtual advisory team for a few years, and my nonprofit just joined their community advocate group. And so we're really going to try and push out the importance of information, you know, and as we move to this strangely weird technology driven and data driven world, I think what we have to realize as patients is how much power we actually have in our data, and not just ourselves. We could help ourselves, obviously, by being able to collect our own data and work with our doctors, but how that information can really help our communities. And so I like to talk to people about healthcare kind of like a pencil. And a pencil is something that no matter where you are in the world, you recognize what a pencil is. You know how to use it for the most part. I don't hold it, right? But you just, you know, everybody knows what it is, but it was not one person that went into making that pencil, right? You had the lead guy and the wood guy that together that everybody in the world could recognize. And that's what I think we need to evolve to in healthcare. You know, I see in the spaces that I am, I go to a lot of different meetings in different spaces. I'm actually at the Precision Medicine World Conference now. And I see hope for all of us, just amazing technologies. But one of the things that I also see is that we as patient communities are broken. You know, we look at ourselves as burdens. We look to other people to help us when we have all of the answers within ourselves. And so I really think it's going to become important as we move forward into the future, especially as I know a lot of people are just getting educated around clinical trials in general, but we're on the verge of decentralized clinical trials and really bringing clinical trials to you, right? Engaging hopefully your own physicians and rebuilding the community that we've kind of lost along the way. You know, our relationships with our physicians have been broken. And there is a lot of mistrust, not just with physicians, but industry and our providers of healthcare insurance and even our legislators. And I think it's time now for us as patients to really organize ourselves. We've had a great discussion all day on the similarities and how we can all help each other. But I think there's so many deeper ways that we can do that. And I think really teaching each other, showing each other, you know, and working with organizations that we know and that we trust, looking to researchers who are really interested in our disease spaces, and really having more of that collaborative look and that holistic look at not only ourselves, but our future. And I think one of the things that when we get a disease, we often tend to look inward, right? It's always about what are you going through and how do you get through this? And I'll give you a little bit of backstory. People think that I have this amazing, so everything I do pretty much is, you know, under my nonprofit now, or really just, but I struggle, right? As a person trying to survive in one of the most expensive areas in the world, and really just see opportunities for us as patients to expand just being a patient and really becoming experts and becoming community members and leaders who give our perspectives and our opinions, because lived experience is a lot. And sometimes it's a lot more than a couple of years of industry experience, but we have to know how to talk to each other. We have to know how to interact with different groups who may not see our immediate stance, and how do we work together to bridge those gaps and to bring everyone together. But I think, again, it's a collaborative mission that's going to take technology and health providers and hospital systems and everyone. But I have hope that we'll get there. You know, I'm in a different space than many patients, and I see the promise on the horizon. And I just really think we need to learn how to organize and help each other out, and really know that what we're dealing with is horrible. Everybody is going through it. And now even normal people are going through it, right? We're getting so much more help now that healthy people are sick. And COVID has been a little bit of a curse, but a blessing. We're seeing things advance very quickly, and we're seeing that, even things like telehealth and telemedicine is great for some people, but we're also realizing we still need a human touch. And so as patients, we have to make sure that that human touch is still there. We have to connect with each other. We have to really, share our journeys and our missions, and look that and know that what we're going through, it's not a shame. It's not a burden. None of us asked for this. We were given something that could really help elevate others, and we have voices that we can use. And so I think legislation is always important, showing your face and really knowing what's out there, looking at the technology. I said I was involved with Stanford Human Wide, and patients like me and people asked me how I got started. It was really just knocking on doors, right? Finding out who was giving out scholarships, learning. That was a big part of it, was sitting back and actually learning different parts of things before I inputted my perspective, and learning how that perspective could be, used in a way that could really get our points across as patients in a different way. And so I want to yield the rest of my time, Sarita, to just a conversation, because, I think the conversation part is always more fascinating. And Nikki, come back, because I want to pick your brain. I have a whole different outlook, right, with whole genome sequencing coming and all of that, on how our future ends up. But again, it's that combined effort. So, hey guys.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kristine and Nikki. So a lot of things that you guys both talked about really jumped out to me. One of the things that you just said, Kristine, was just talking about the different patient communities and how we're all so broken. And it made me think about something that your organization speaks to, and that's silos, and how, we find ourselves in these silo communities, whether it's the patient community, if it's the research community, if it's the digital health space. Like, how do we break the silos? How do we create those collaborative opportunities for patients? And honestly, everybody in this space, all the stakeholders. How do we start that?
For me, I think it's the conversation. I think it's bringing educated people to the table, right? And really building on each other. I'm always happy, to elevate someone else's voice and bring them in. I think we need to have more conversations instead of one person speaking and giving a perspective. And we need to look at the issues from every angle of these things, right? We have so many organizations who are all doing the same exact things, right? And we all have our strengths and our weaknesses. And what we need to do is play on those strengths and weaknesses, right? I am not great at the business side of things, but I am great at networking and connecting and finding out what companies and what people should be working together. And I think we need to take more of that type of viewpoint. I look at it as kind of like in relation to my life and my nationality and everything, right? I'm a mix. And my mom is Filipino, my dad is German Irish. I don't have one disease, there's multiple. I don't fit into a box. And I know so many other people don't, so I think it's those conversations that break out of those boxes that need to be had, and need to be had with all of us there. I go to a lot of conferences, and HCP conferences don't have pharma, and pharma don't have physicians, and patients don't have regulators. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of a mess. Nikki, you're on mute.
Thank you. I completely agree, with Kristine's sentiment, right? And one thing that she stated that really stuck out to me, one from a patient perspective, but also just from, a technology perspective, and how do we design these digital health, accessibility applications. And that is to keep the human element front and center, because she is right. Just the connectivity is incredibly powerful. And I think that, as she stated, really where we kind of start, or at least a good springboard, is kind of finding small little pockets of communities, such as Patients Like Me, or maybe you find a Facebook group, which is fantastic as well. However, not everyone is going to gravitate towards that type of community. So I think, as Kristine had stated as well, is something that needs to have a lot of consideration is everyone working collectively to kind of figure this out together, not in these silos. And I don't have a straightforward answer. If I did, I'd be a billionaire, but I think that we're on the right track.
I want to make a really, oh, sorry, Sarita. I want to make a really funny comment. So I grew up in Silicon Valley, right? And we went from very small community to very big tech. And we have a lot of very smart individuals. Some of the greatest, most intelligent people in the world live here, but they also have a very low EQ, right? And I think we have to bring that emotional intelligence to the people that have that technology-driven mind, and make sure, you know, that we're considering those things, because they are great at finding problems and solutions. But the other part of it, you know, isn't always people's wheelhouse, right? So we've got to, again, bring that connected. But Sarita, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go right ahead.
No, I was actually, you know, she was joking about being a billionaire. It made me think about, you know, the stats that she gave during her talk about startups contributing $29.1 billion, and that was $15 billion more than the previous year. And I think you said it, Kristine, when you said, you know, COVID has been both a curse and a blessing. You know, what are your thoughts? I think we've learned that virtual isn't bad. You know, it's an opportunity. The digital climate is something that's been a benefit to a lot of patient communities. And COVID kind of brought that to the surface. Like, what are your thoughts about that? I think personally, it has expanded a lot of platforms that may not have otherwise expanded had they not had those virtual opportunities. And so I just love your thoughts about it and how we've grown in the digital space because of that.
So my thoughts, I know, Sarita, you and I have talked about this as well. I think, you know, we look at ourselves often as patients, like I said, like a burden, like we don't have a purpose, right? And I think that one of the things we have to think about as patients is reverse that thinking, right? And realize that this entire industry is based off of our data, right? So if there are new technologies, if there are things that need to be built, we need as a community to combine ourselves together, because I'm telling you, a couple thousand patients are a lot more powerful than anything that industry has to offer. And if we can organize ourselves in the way that we trust ourselves, and we can share our data among ourselves and use that as leverage when we're looking at treating our own diseases and looking at our quality of life. There are a million companies that jumped into healthcare when COVID hit and profits became a thing again, right? We were moving towards a really empathetic world for a little while there. And then we kind of took a shift. And so I think as patients, we also have to realize where our data is going, who we're giving it to, right? What is happening to that data after the fact? Is it being sold to third-party companies? Is it being used for things that you may not be aware of? Those are things that we also have to really take a stronger hold on and really talk about, right? We sign consent forms out of desperation when we really should be looking at things as a whole community before we allow each other to even do these things, you know? And so I think California has a thing, right? I mean, I go to other states and I travel and it says, if you're a California resident, you can opt out, and I can say, do not sell my data. I can't do that if I'm in another state. And I think those are things that we have to look at as patients, is more of the business side of this. We are contributing all of the information that goes into this business, but are we getting anything back out of it? So.
And that's a really good point. Nikki, I want you to chime in on that too, but I was just going to say really quickly, I think that's why so many organizations are so protective of their patient data. I think, I think we're doing so much hoarding of the information because we feel like we're protecting the data rather than having those conversations to figure out how can we collaboratively still protect the data, but still work together to reach a broader group of people. And so, I think when we use that as our reason behind we don't share, that's an opportunity to change our perspectives and grow. Because other organizations, it just leads to further silos, right? Like everybody's trying to have patient data, and a lot of it is all the same. And then you have the patients getting frustrated because that's just another organization that's asking for more data. So Nikki, go ahead if you wanted to chime in on that.
Sure. So, I think I fully agree with what Kristine was stating. And, again, the power falls back on us personally, because you have to think about something. We have this perspective that, oh my goodness, we are, relying on these companies to heal us and to help us. But flip the script, those companies are relying on us for their profits. And we talk about these things, and I'm very open to, I like the aspect of us thinking collectively that we need to share the data. But in technology, there's a little saying, he who owns the data, is the winner. That's the person, that's the richest in the room. That's what's going to happen. And, I don't see organizations from a business standpoint handing that over easily. I just don't. Now, I do think that there have been some aspects that are coming to light that are starting to change this perspective. I am almost positive that what I think they're calling it ARPA, was approved by the president, and he signed that into a bill for more exchanging of research information, and kind of having it to where we can have a centralized location to kind of access this data, which is definitely something that needs to be done specifically for treatments development into like rare diseases and those types of things, because bringing a treatment to the market, you need very large amounts of data sets. And when you're dealing with a rare disease, you're not going to have large amounts of data sets. It's just not possible. So I do think we have a lot to work on, but I also feel like things are shifting, the tides are changing, and I think they're changing in the right direction.
And I want to mention too, I work with an organization, I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're actually called the lightcollective.org. Lightcollective.org is their site. And they are really an organization focused on patients' rights and digital rights, right? They're looking at the metaverse, they're looking at Facebook, they're looking at everything, and really the security points around protecting us as patients. So if you're a patient and organization, there is a pledge that they have, and everybody can take the pledge. They actually recently spoke on stage at the Stat News conference and really talking about data privacy and digital rights and how we take agency over our data as patients, because that is a conversation that's going to need to happen at some point, right? Especially as we build out into this metaverse and making sure, again, that my digital Kristine isn't being taken advantage of. There is a lot of discussions, around those issues on human rights, even for our digital people and what countries they reside in. So it's going to be a long and an interesting, I don't want to say battle, because I don't want to put a negative connotation to it, but I think we all know how sometimes industry works. But I do want to say, I think a lot of times we criticize the people that work in industry. And I do have to say, we cannot criticize individuals for a system that we allow, to happen, right? And we really need to start getting, taking accountability and really going out there and again, back to that voting issue, right? As we move into these issues around ownership of data, the voting is going to become very important for those of us who are underserved and minority populations, right? I've talked to economists at Stanford and globally who see this as the new data economy, right? And that this is potentially a chance to make things right again if we can educate people and do it in the right manner. So totally hopeful. But Sarita, what are your thoughts?
So I'm thinking about I've heard of a lot of platforms. Several of them are fairly new that speak to patients owning their data. They actually store the patient data, but the patients can opt in to how the data is shared. And so I have a few thoughts about it. I think there's value in the collective effort, and I think there's value in the voice. I am one of those people who, not for reasons behind the person who holds the data is the star in the room, but just that concern of protecting patient privacy. I think when it comes to collecting data, especially, on the organization side of it, we want to know that we are the ones keeping that information safe. And so, I'm still on the learning curve of it all, because I understand why it's so important to protect it. But I also find value in having access to the data for the purpose of creating greater and more solutions and treatment options and research efforts and all that kind of stuff. So,
and I think, Sarita, in answer to that, I think if we were able to enable, if patient organizations were able to pair together and really unite, right, and have that trust between each other, at some point, I actually see negotiations between patient groups and industry, right, and them being able to make those, we don't have one yet, but there should be a materials transfer agreement that goes from patient groups to industry and research with an e-consent, which some of you may not be familiar with, but it's really just the ability in an electronic fashion, right, to be able to take away some of these consents if you find that someone is not doing right by a community, right? And so I think there are ways that we can potentially, and I think there's tons of companies out there, some with good intentions, some not so good intentions. And I think it's up to us as patients to really vet those people that are out there and share our information about who we like, who we, and those types of things to really build not only their communities, but ours, and build those bonds to really keep those relationships going. But I have the same concerns, right? And I feel for children of rare disease, right? I got sick as a kid. Luckily, I got to work, but there are so many kids out there who will never have a possibility or a chance to work. And this could be their saving grace, right? This could be their income, their basic income provided by the data they are collecting. So I think it's that weird balance, right? We're right in that beginning and that early adopters. And I've heard people say we're in the wild, wild west, right? It could go one way or the other. And I'm hoping for the good guys.
Yeah. Well, I have to agree. I think as we continue to just grow as a rare disease community, I have to say, we have been in the rare space just a little over 5 years. And just the momentum that we have seen just in that short amount of time has been amazing. So, I'm really hopeful that as we continue, we find value in understanding more and figuring out how we can work more closely together. But I'm just a huge advocate behind collaboration and networking, kind of like what you were saying, Kristine, about being a networker. I recognize when it comes to conversations a lot of times just because you can speak to something doesn't mean you should. You know, I think there's always opportunity for us to bring other voices into the conversation. And I think we ought to take advantage of those opportunities if it's going to help the patient population. So of course, we can continue talking throughout the rest of the conference about this topic because it covers so many different areas, but we are going to pause right here and start prepping for session 4. We're going to take another quick break. We'll probably do about a 10-minute break, but we'll do another quick break and then we'll come back and kick off with session 4. Thank you so much to Kristine and Nikki. Do you guys have any final words before we close out this session?
Nikki, I just want to say it was fun. And for anyone that's listening, feel free to reach out. I'm on, unfortunately, I said it in the comments, I'm on every social media, including TikTok. At 47, I did not think I would ever say that, but I'm there. And just really, I'm going to head back into the other conference. I won't hit the last session, but I'm going to catch the recording. And again, Sarita, I adore you and thank you for putting this together.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Nikki?
All right, thank you. Yeah, Kristine, this was great. I like our synergy. I hope that you and I have an opportunity to do something together in the future. And again, Sarita, I absolutely love your organization. I love what you folks have done in such a short amount of time. It is absolutely amazing and provides so many with hope. And that's what we need. So with that, thanks so much, everyone. I appreciate you.
Good stuff. All right. Well, thank you so much. All right, guys. So we're going to take another quick break. Let's do about 10 minutes and then we'll come back for session 4.
Hi everyone, I'm Shivani Vyas and welcome to today's Young Adult Legislative Advocacy session. We are going to go ahead and get started now. All right, so today's agenda, me, Ella, and Laura will be covering the 3 topics: the importance of young adult advocacy, legislative advocacy on the federal level, and then finally legislative advocacy on the state level. And we're going to be discussing how you can get involved through different opportunities and things like that. So a brief introduction. So I'm Shivani and I'm the host of the Rare Disorder podcast and a rare disease advocate. Ella Balassa is an advocate and consultant. And then Laura is a rare disease advocate. And all of us got involved or are very involved through YAR, which is Young Adult Representatives of RDLA. So rare disease legislative advocates. So I'm going to be talking about the importance of young adult advocacy today. So I'm a freshman at Duke and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. And my connection to the rare disease community is that I had a grandmother who was diagnosed with the rare pancreatic cancer. And although I was very young at the time, my parents have talked multiple times about the difficulty we had finding resources and answers just because her cancer was so rare. And we would look around and we couldn't really find that many resources that were out there. So this is what got me initially immersed in the rare disease community as I kind of looked around on Instagram and different social media platforms and found that rare diseases are not as rare as I originally thought. So in March of 2020, I decided to create a podcast called the Rare Disorder Podcast to bring awareness to rare diseases and rare disorders in the broader medical community, as well as allow patients a platform to share their stories through storytelling. And my main motive going into this was really to elevate patient voices, just because I really believe that patient stories and experiences matter. And I really wanted a way to empower patients in their own story and in their own identity. So this podcast has two different series. My first is Meet a Fighter, which is a series where I invite patients on to share their stories, discuss their story with me through an interview style format. And then I have a Meet an Expert series where I invite on rare disease organization leaders and influential people in the rare disease space to kind of share resources that are out there and all of these other types of like advocacy opportunities and things like that. So eventually, as I continued podcasting and connecting with more patients and advocates, many other opportunities opened to me, including YAR. And this allowed me to create a direct impact through legislative work. And later on, I'm going to be discussing how you can do this too and kind of really take that step and deep dive into rare disease advocacy. And just this past February, I participated in my first legislative conference type thing, which was Rare Disease Week 2022, which was organized by rare disease legislative advocates. So why does advocacy matter, especially in the rare disease space? So in the United States, a disease is considered rare when it affects fewer than 200,000 people. Researchers estimate that there are more than 7,000 rare diseases currently, and rare diseases affect an estimated 30 million Americans. And lastly, 93% of rare diseases have no FDA-approved treatment. So these statistics kind of really show us that advocacy is needed, and we should always strive to bring awareness to rare diseases. So the next steps in your advocacy journey. So if you're just starting out, I would recommend, if you're a young adult, you can join a young adult group focused on advocacy. YAR is the perfect opportunity for this. You can also meet with your legislators through Rare Disease Week on Capitol Hill and Rare Across America, which is coming up, and I'll talk about that in a second. So YAR stands for the Young Adult Representatives of RDLA. And this is a highly motivated group of 16 to 30-year-olds from the rare disease community. The main purpose of YAR is to instill confidence in the next generation of rare disease advocates. So as I was saying earlier, I kind of found out about YAR through my podcast and meeting different advocates. And actually Laura, who is on this panel today and will be speaking later, I interviewed them on my podcast, and this is kind of how I was introduced to YAR, because they were talking about how they do a lot of advocacy work through YAR and things like that. And it's been a really great opportunity for me. And just if you want to kind of dive into advocacy in general, just because there's so many opportunities to meet other people. I have found a really tight community through YAR and have made a lot of friends. And I think this is really important, just because support is really important when you're kind of diving into this advocacy realm in the rare disease space. So if you're interested in meeting with your legislators from the stories I've told, you can register for Rare Across America, which is a chance to meet with your senators and House representatives while Congress is on summer recess back in their home districts. This year, House meetings will be at your local in-state office in person, and Senate meetings will be virtual. You can attend either or both kinds of meetings based on how comfortable you are. And just a key date, registration closes on July 8th. So I encourage you to register soon if you want to attend. You'll get a lot more information and training leading up to your meetings. I'll be there, and I hope to talk with you more. So if you're interested, feel free to take a picture of the slide and make sure to register by July 8th. So another easy way to get your voice heard is by participating in one of the Hill meetings with your legislator during Rare Disease Week. especially if you're new to meeting with your legislators. So as I said, this was the first time I kind of met with my legislators, and I found it super easy, super seamless process. There was so much guidance provided and training, so I highly encourage this. So RDLA brings together over 800 advocates from around the country each year to advocate for policy issues that are important to the rare disease community. And this past February, I was blown away by how empowered I really felt in the end. And it's a really great opportunity to connect directly with your legislators. And the best part is that RDLA takes care of all the logistics and things like that for you, like setting up meetings, things like that. They offer plenty of support leading up to the meetings, and you definitely do not have to be a policy expert to attend. Just keep an eye out for the registration opening in early 2023. Feel free to take a picture of this slide as well, if you're interested, just so you can keep an eye out. All right, so that's it for me. Thank you everyone for your time and attention. I'll now be passing it to Ella Balassa, who will speak more on federal advocacy.
All right, thanks Shivani, and thanks for having me as part of this presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the power of federal advocacy. You know, as patients, patient advocates, and as the public, we have the power to effect change in the political process, and this means, you know, changing legislation and policies to improve healthcare. You can go to the next slide. So, you know, as I said, there are a variety of ways where healthcare can be modified and improved through legislation and policies and public policies that impact science, like depending on what is being researched and where like funding goes, and even like reimbursements to industry. So that's like the Pasteur Act, and that pertains to the development of antibiotics. Legislation also affects the drug development process, as well as FDA regulations, and you know how quickly a potential treatment may be reviewed by the FDA, or you know if it's given like fast track approval. You know, these would be things like the STAT Act, a benefit, or PDUFA, as that was mentioned before, and then also access to treatments. Federal policies can require certain medications to be, you know, accessible for patients on formularies with insurance plans. So that's just one example, and drug pricing is another. So, and then also inclusivity in clinical trials, and having appropriate population representation in trials. So these are a couple of different areas in healthcare that can be affected and changed by legislative advocacy. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about my own advocacy now, and how that's, you know, kind of that intertwining there with the federal advocacy I've done. So I have cystic fibrosis, which is a progressive genetic disease, and I was diagnosed at 1 year old. It's a disease that's characterized by the buildup of thick mucus in the lungs, and this causes a cycle of inflammation and infections, and it does require lifelong treatment with antibiotics to treat these infections. And over time, these infections deteriorate lung tissue, and it leads to a shortened life expectancy due to lung failure. So over the course of my life, I've had countless hospitalizations requiring intravenous antibiotics, and daily I do about 4 inhaled breathing treatments to clear this mucus from my lungs. I have a degree in biology, and I worked in a lab for a number of years. So that's about the time when I started really getting involved in advocacy, as lending my voice as a patient perspective in research. So I felt that my background certainly helped in bridging these gaps that I saw in healthcare, and specifically in drug development. And in 2018, I faced a very difficult lung infection, an antibiotic resistant infection that didn't respond to any treatment. And that's when I resorted to trying an experimental treatment that wasn't FDA approved. And that period of time was the most difficult and scary health experiences that I've had to date, just because of really there was nothing to treat my infection, and it was rampant, and there was nothing I could do about it. And I was functioning at like 18% lung function. So as you can imagine, I was very limited in what I could do physically and requiring supplemental oxygen and things. So fast forward, that treatment ended up helping me, but I wanted to share about this experience publicly and raise awareness about the need for the development of new antibiotics to treat people like me who, face bacterial infections that are resistant to all antibiotics. So I wrote about this experience. I shared my patient story with advocacy groups working in raising awareness about antibiotic resistance. And then from there, I was asked to speak at conferences and meetings, sharing about my story. And I spoke on panels at like the Milken Institute and FDA, to FDA, the Rare Disease Day and FDA, and also at congressional meetings with Virginia legislators from the House and various nonprofit groups too, like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and the Presidential Advisory Council on Antibiotic Resistant Bacteria, the Infectious Disease Society of America. And a lot of those meetings and appearances that I made were in regard to the support of the Pasteur Act and the spurring of innovation to incentivize industry to develop novel antibiotics. So, beyond, this has been my major focus, but beyond this, I've also been a part of the Every Life Foundation and was selected as a rare artist last year. I'm actually going to go to the next slide. Sorry, I didn't say that. So that's my drawing there, actually. I was a rare artist, and I depicted, I drew a picture of lungs in the shape of branches that resembles the lungs of people with CF. And so through my art expression, I've been able to impact CF awareness nationally as well. And there are also some other ways that, advocacy resources that I've used to expand my own knowledge of advocacy and involvement, and particularly the RDLA and YAR, as Shivani mentioned. They have like monthly webinars that really provide a lot of valuable information and keeping up to date as patients with policy changes and policy creations that are happening. And then also the Patients Rising Masterclass. That's really incredible resource for learning about advocacy and the topics that, and really the areas of focus where our voices can elicit changes. So those are just two areas that or two things that I've been involved in that have really expanded my advocacy efforts as well. You can go to the next slide. So this is to say that, our voices matter, your advocacy matters. There are so many hurdles and healthcare problems that exist, and humanizing these challenges helps to move the healthcare industry and improves health outcomes. So, I think when we're sharing our voices, it's inspiring innovation and it's spurring effort from policymakers. And I think it's important to say that your legislators want to hear from you. We are the constituents, we are the people that they serve, and we are the experts in our own rare disease and in our experiences, and we have the best knowledge and understanding of what is important for people like us living with our diseases and our conditions, and we can serve as a voice for other people. And I think that is what is the most motivation for me, is that I know that by raising my voice, I'm helping others like myself who can't or don't know how to start. And this is why it's so important to have webinars such as these, where we as patient advocates are encouraging each other, encouraging others, and more people to be empowered and to use our voices for change. We are the consumers in healthcare, and we need it to serve us. And change does come about when we make our issues and our obstacles heard. And I think there's just so much collective power in patients coming together and talking about treatments, research, and things that aren't working in healthcare, and where these changes need to be affected. And this really does grab the attention and elicit changes from policymakers and industry and advocacy groups alike. There's this can happen in a variety of ways. You can go to the next slide. Yeah. Raising our voices can happen in a variety of ways. And we all know that having face-to-face contact and communication is the most effective. It can affect us the most emotionally. As we know, with these Zoom, definitely had Zoom fatigue for a while there, right, during COVID. But, same thing, I think, when we're connecting and communicating with our legislators. So, in person, it's shown that in-person visits from constituents to legislators significantly has a positive impact. And this is taken from a survey from the Congressional Management Foundation. After that, letters and emails and calls are quite valuable as well. But that's just something to keep in mind when we are connecting with our legislators, and how we can do that. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've been talking quite abstractly now, but now I want to give more specifics on what the federal landscape legislative process involves. So it starts with an idea, and that becomes a proposed bill in the House or the Senate by a member of Congress. And then both the Senate and the House have to vote on a bill before it passes. And then if it does, it is signed into law by the president. But there's a lot of back and forth discussion and negotiating in committees between the House and the Senate before that's actually approved by both. And as advocates, here's where we can come in and, we can write, to these committees, speak to our congressmen to, support a bill, or to have the committees hear these bills to move it along through Congress. Even when a bill is introduced, you can advocate, before it's really in the discussions, you can advocate, with your congressman too. And especially through a public means, newspapers, TV, local news, any sort of written content too that pertains to these bills or, policy changes is important to capture that attention. And they're, specific to the rare disease community, the ones that are most relevant would be, funding the CDC, NIH, Health and Human Services agencies, and the Department of Labor and Education. So these are the areas that, obviously would impact the rare disease community. And then, of course, also the FDA, right? There's a lot of policies regarding the FDA that really do directly impact the way that patients in rare disease or any disease really are able to access treatments, and the speed by which new innovation is brought through. And there's also what are called congressional caucuses. So there's the Rare Disease Congressional Caucus, and this is a group of members of Congress that meets to pursue common legislative objectives within rare disease for this one, but there are hundreds of caucuses, and they consist of, an interest group. So these caucuses can hold briefings to raise awareness about rare disease, and these are not they're not bills in and of themselves, but they're just ways that this kind of conversation can come about, and then a bill could be potentially introduced through this, raising awareness or about a specific topic in rare disease within legislators. I think is really important just to have that conversation. So this is a great way that, the rare disease conversation and just health policy is really relevant and discussed broadly in Congress. So I think that's my last slide. And I appreciate being here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have after Laura gives their talk about state legislative advocacy.
Thanks, Ella. I'm Laura, and I'm here to talk to you a bit today about state legislative advocacy. Next slide. So briefly, my connection to rare: I am a rare disease patient. I'm diagnosed with classical-like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder. I was diagnosed at 18 after several years of medical issues and didn't confirm the diagnosis of the exact subtype until I was 22. That was quite the diagnostic odyssey. I've been a member of YAR since 2021. And I'm a graduate of the YAR Leadership Academy and the Speakers Bureau training, which were some ways that I was able to further learn how to use my voice for some advocacy. Next slide. So for me, prior to this year specifically, most of my advocacy has been more at the federal level, but I'm getting more into the state advocacy and finding that I really love it. In 2017, I joined the EDS New England, it used to be EDS Massachusetts support group, which was just a group for people with my condition to get together and sort of talk to each other, get to know each other, have a community. And through that, I was able to connect with a few smaller advocacy events. Most notably, I helped with a Marfan Foundation event where they did just some tabling outside of the Rent National Tour while it was in Boston. And then in 2021 and 2022, I worked with Governor Baker's office here in Massachusetts to have the month of May recognized as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and hypermobility spectrum disorders awareness month, which was a really cool opportunity to sort of work one-on-one with these offices to tweak language for these proclamations, to really write some good press releases that shared some great information about the condition, as well as other ways that people could get involved in the rare disease space. And then most recently, just earlier this month, I attended the Massachusetts State Advocacy Day put on by the EveryLife Foundation. And I was a speaker at the morning conference, and then I got to meet with state legislator offices in the afternoon to advocate for a few state policies that would really help the rare disease community here in Massachusetts. Next slide. So when it comes to the state level, there are quite a few different policies that could have great impact on the rare disease community that you can get involved in with in your own home state. Most of my experience at the state level comes with these first 4 bullet points, so I can speak a little bit more in detail on those. So the first one on here is step therapy, or this idea of fail first. And the legislation for that would basically give doctors the ability to override insurance companies saying that you have to try a different treatment before they'll cover the one that your provider recommends. So this would give them some avenues to take if this type of therapy could be harmful to their patient. The next is about copay accumulators, which is the idea that when you get like a drug coupon, that doesn't count out of your deductible or your out of pocket maximum. So this would make sure that insurance companies aren't double dipping from patients. The next is medical licensure, which specifically I think about the idea of, I believe it's called the compact, that would allow providers to be licensed for telehealth in multiple states without as many hoops to jump through, which would be amazing for the rare disease community, because as many of us know, you cannot always access care in your home state. And for a lot of us, travel is difficult and expensive. So having ways that you could meet with your specialist online would be amazing and a great way to expand the access we've seen with some of the COVID rulings that allowed us to have expanded telehealth access. The next is the access to genetic counselors. And that would just basically make sure that genetic counselors are able to work in the full scope of their practice, and that those services are available to the patients who need them for accurate testing and diagnostics. There are also policies surrounding Medicaid that you can be involved in your home state, as well as newborn screening, which is vital to make sure that these rare diseases are getting diagnosed as early as possible and treated as early as possible. Next slide. So there are a lot of actions you can take as an advocate at the state level. There are state organizations, like I mentioned with that EDS organization. These are nonprofit organizations that connect advocates, and through these organizations, you can advocate for state and federal legislation. You can get together as a community. You can share education with both the rare disease patients and the general public. And it's a great starting point for people who are newly diagnosed, either as a patient themselves or as families of a patient. And this is a great way to just meet people, make connections, and learn more about how you can get involved. There are also rare disease state legislative caucuses, which is essentially state legislators who come together about common objectives that would affect the rare disease community. Last but not least, there are Rare Disease Advisory Council, which is a place for stakeholders to advise legislators on rare disease issues and experiences. And these have a wide variety of roles in them. So usually there's patient advocate, parent advocate, healthcare providers, researchers, organization leaders, and even more. Usually you have a variety of types of healthcare providers. So these are really awesome opportunities to get involved in the state level as well. Next slide. There's also the RDLA State Advocacy Hub, which is a great resource for people who are wanting to become involved in advocacy at the state level. This is a great place to find resources about healthcare regulations and bills that would impact the rare disease community in your own state. Next slide. And last but not least, it's important to remember that your story and your advocacy matter. Meeting with your legislators, especially in your home state, is a great opportunity to use your story to put a face to rare disease. People hear rare disease and they think, how many people can that really affect? Why does it matter? Why should I care if it's rare? But by putting a face and a story to the term rare disease, you're taking the power and you're showing the humanity behind these conditions. Next slide.
So here's our contact information. If you have any other questions, you can reach out to us. And if you would like to keep up with the young adult representatives of RDLA or even join, here is the contact information. Feel free to take a picture. All right, so now we're going to be going into a panel discussion. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. All right, so if all our panelists could turn on their cameras, that would be great. And we are just going to kick this off by how could one get started in rare disease advocacy? For example, how do you initiate possible solutions for an issue you may see on your local news station or just on the television one day?
So I'm going to jump in. I'm new here. A lot of great information from the last two panelists, presenters. And I'm Jennifer Harris, to introduce myself with Alabama Rise. I'm the health policy advocate there. And I'm not new to the advocacy space, as I'm also the caregiver of a child with a rare disorder. And I work every day to kind of do what you just said, because a lot of times people will see legislative advocacy, they'll see people on the news, they'll hear about events and things to go to, and they're not really sure where to start and where to begin, because we always have to begin somewhere. And that comes in with the work that I'm blessed to be able to do. So some of the things that you can think about is that I'm just going to repeat a lot of things that was said today that we all need to hear. We all have a voice, and our voice is important. And we all have information that we know about, and information that we're more likely to be an expert, or even if we don't feel like it, pretty close to being an expert about. And I'm sure most of you all here can truly understand that in the rare disorder space, excuse me. So a lot of times when you see those things, they have to start somewhere. And when people identify issue, they may not know who else to speak to, who else is experiencing this, or who they can connect to, they can understand and help them organize. So I'll use an example of a project that I am currently beginning to work on. Cerebral cancer rates have been identified as a huge issue in rural Alabama. So one of the projects that we are planning to work on with one of our partners is to reduce those rates by creating local advocates within the community, because those advocates are going to know the community, they're going to know the needs, and they're going to know the resources. And so I'll be meeting with those advocates later this summer. We'll be doing a 3-day training that gives an overview of everything from realizing communication styles to getting to how you discuss your issues, and also how you identify the issues, but also to encourage people to look at their strengths and where they lie, so that they can know things like, I am not the person to get up and do public speaking. I'm not the person to reach out to the media, but I will be there to do letters, or I will knock on doors, or I will call people, so that they can have very good organizing efforts to really magnify those strengths, but among the group. And so that's how those things kind of begin. And then if someone has not identified the issue, you can go and say, this is what we've identified, this is what we know, this is the work that we have been doing, so that you can move into those next levels that'll be at the state level or onto the federal level.
Thanks for sharing that, Jennifer. I think that was a fantastic example of a way to, somebody can get started in advocacy. Just to add to that, I would say, like, my involvement with nonprofit groups, specifically in cystic fibrosis, paved the way for, my involvement in federal advocacy and those opportunities to connect with legislators and, project my voice to a larger audience. So, I would say, even getting involved in community efforts then grows beyond that, as you just described. So, I think, it doesn't have to start big. It can be very small and very local, but our voices grow, and with the effort of other people's too in our community, that can expand and can reach the federal, state, and federal levels very quickly. So, don't be intimidated. Have that confidence in what you know about your health and about your care and the problems you identify, and make that known. And don't be afraid to reach out to local media if you feel comfortable doing that. The answer might be no if that's what you're afraid of, but you don't know until you ask. So I think that that's something I really live by is, don't be afraid to ask, because you don't know the answer. It might be a yes, and you might be able to move your issue or your topic forward through whatever means that is. So.
And if the answer is no, it may really be no, not right now, or no, not this way. There's always a solution to be found somewhere.
Sort of build on what Ella was just saying about how this sort of work can be intimidating at first. I think a lot of people hear the term legislative advocacy. I know at least I did, and felt very intimidated by that. Felt like you don't have the background to understand these policies in depth, but you really don't need to when you're starting out. It's so important to just start out by knowing how to use your story, to know that your story has value and meaning, and that by sharing your story, you're making a difference. You're putting a face, you're putting a story to these more abstract concepts that someone who doesn't know someone who has a rare disease doesn't understand the humanity behind it.
Yeah, just kind of building off what Laura said. I remember when I was starting out, I was kind of intimidated by like all of the different like bills, all the different terms that people were kind of talking about. But one thing I've noticed is that there's so much support provided and so much training. There are like one pagers for the bills so you can like learn about them. I just feel that also just the community and people around me were so willing to help me, like knowing it was my first time. So just know that there's lots of support and training that will really help you. So don't be intimidated to start putting your voice out there.
And a very good point. I'll say I am based in Alabama at Alabama Rise. We're one of those agencies that do those things where we break down the legislative sessions, the bills and things. So find those same types of organizations where you are, because there's always somebody there and your story does need to be heard.
All right, so kind of just building off what we all were talking about, kind of getting your voice out there. How would you prepare for a day of advocacy?
For me, when I'm getting ready for any type of an advocacy day, my first step is always just doing a quick Google search about whatever specific legislative asks we're going through, whether that's, you know, reading through the one-pagers that have been provided, or just sort of looking up the history of who already is in support of this bill, who the co-sponsors of the bill are, where the bill has gotten so far, where it currently is standing, just to really familiarize myself with what I'm going into these meetings asking my legislators for. And I also like to do a quick search of the legislative offices that I'm meeting with to sort of learn a little bit more about the person and what other things they support, what their history with the rare disease community is, because that can be a great way to sort of break the ice. Is if you have something you can thank a legislator for that they've already done for the community, that sort of puts you on some common ground, that you're like, this person has already done something that has helped our community. You want to make sure you're thanking them for that, because it shows that you actually appreciate them doing this for us. But then also just like going in and knowing that I'm confident and I know my story and I know how to make other people care about my story is really important too. So I try to like brush up on exactly what my elevator pitch is going to be and what the most important things that I want to share in relation to these legislative asks. Because obviously every rare disease patient or caregiver has a very vast story. You don't always have time to give every single detail. So picking and choosing what's the most relevant is really important before these meetings as well.
And you also may want to think about, when I've done advocacy days, we've taken that information to kind of leave behind. They kind of have that visual there, that tangible item that they can pick up and look at. That kind of summarizes the things that you are thanking them for, showing that gratitude, as well as like why this will help me or people like me, and as well as this is the impact this can have as well. So that has also been something that I found helpful on advocacy days.
Yeah, I would say just kind of going into the meetings, knowing like what point you want to get across, because usually it's a lot of you meeting with a legislator for a pretty short amount of time. So there's not like a lot of time for each person to speak. So kind of knowing exactly what you want to communicate with them, whether that is asking them for support of a bill or a specific act, just kind of going in knowing that is really helpful.
And might I add that even if you are not necessarily comfortable speaking, go there to be seen, go there so they can know the numbers as well and to be supportive in that place as well.
All right, so a question has come in. How can I get involved at the state level with advocacy? They've done some federal advocacy with RDLA in the past, but specifically, how can they get involved in the state?
I'll
I'll
chime
give another
in.
little.
Oh.
Go ahead, Jennifer. You go first.
I'll say I would chime in again and say find those organizations, and it will usually be more than one. Many of them will be overlapping, and you will be amazed sometimes when you begin doing that research to say, wow, this could fit here or fit here, and you'll usually see those organizations are working together. So find those that are doing that, going through those 100+ page bills, pulling out the important things that will be relevant to what you're advocating for and what your needs are. And once you make those connections, the network is going to grow and expand, because it's not just going to be like, it's just going to be one group necessarily.
And I'll add just another plug for that State Advocacy Hub. That's a great resource that you can go to learn more about what's happening in your state as far as policies and bills that need voices behind them. And then from there, even just something as simple as sending an email to your legislator's office is advocating. It doesn't have to be formal meetings. It doesn't have to be an organized day with other advocates. It can be as simple as a phone call, a letter, an email.
So kind of after doing all this state advocacy, how do like these community and state efforts eventually become federal legislation? What would the process look like?
I think sometimes it starts usually with an idea somewhere. Like I recently learned about the new 588, if you all are not familiar with that, that all states are supposed to roll out to be similar to 911, but for suicide prevention. And as we were kind of discussing this, it's not, as usually goes, it's not rolling out as smoothly as it was thought about. But the idea started somewhere, and it probably built and took root. And then usually different types of groups are looking at what's being done at neighboring states or across the United States. And there are usually larger organizations as well that are supporting the work that is being done in the states, that also are connectors for us to network on and continue doing this type of work. Because it'll be very similar to what I said a moment ago. When you begin looking in your state, you'll start seeing things that are being done in other states, neighboring states, and you'll make those connections there. And then once we kind of see that need, then it begins moving to that federal level, because we do want to remember that we have local representatives, we have state representatives, and we have federal representatives all within our own states.
So if one's interested in kind of emailing or calling their legislators, how could they find out who their legislators are in order to get in contact with them?
Probably doing a quick Google search would help. Going to the Secretary of State's website will also be a good place to start, because it's also going to let you know how to register to vote if you are not registered to vote, or if you need to help someone get registered to vote. And that's going to be starting to where you'll see where those local representatives are, as well as those state representatives are.
So does anyone want to share their like favorite memory from Rare Disease Week, or just advocating in the past? Just something that kind of really stuck with them, or is their favorite memory?
This is not an example of advocating on the Hill, but it was for Rare Disease Day at FDA. And I was a panelist on one of the sessions discussing antibiotic resistance and how basically the FDA can improve their, I guess, regulation or, surrounding developing new treatments, and how to get more N of 1 or expanded access trials to new therapies. So that's an area where I also advocate quite a bit for, as in cystic fibrosis, there's obviously a small patient population, and with a lot of exclusion criteria, not many patients can participate in these trials. And so, having the possibility to access some of these treatments early or, without outside of a traditional clinical trial is really important. And so that was a pretty exciting experience. And having just not that long ago been delved really into advocacy, that was in 2020, so right before COVID started. And so at the time, that was right at the beginning of my advocacy work. And so it was just a really cool experience to have my voice in that sort of platform. And that really is one of the catalysts to, having my involvement now and much more advocacy and, federally and in general. So I would say that's been the best experience so far.
For me, one of my favorite advocacy moments was at this recent state advocacy day. It was my first time doing any sort of in-person meetings with legislative offices. And during one of my meetings, we met with a legislative aide who actually had a younger sister who had a rare disease, who had sadly passed away. But it was this amazing moment of connection, of finding someone who understood on a very deeply personal level what we were there to talk about, and being able to hear her story as well, and her input about these pieces of legislation, and her really being so on board with what we were saying, because she knew firsthand what it felt like to be in a rare disease family, was just such a powerful moment, but also just such a good reminder that like rare disease doesn't discriminate. Like every family has a chance of being affected by a rare disease.
And my favorite memory would be the first advocacy day that I attended for sickle cell in 2019 on the Hill. It was just the sheer volume of seeing the number of people there, just the exchange of conversations, just like Laura said, making the connections when you're speaking to people, and even not even in the offices, like in the hallways. It was just that energy. I just love the energy because it really just fueled the feeling of hope and of connecting and people understanding, so that things would continue to improve and continue to get better.
Yeah, I would say my favorite memory was definitely this past Rare Disease Week. I remember that with one of my meetings with legislators, one of the people who was with me asked our legislator to join the congressional caucus for rare disease. And just like a couple of weeks after, they emailed back and said that they had joined. So it was kind of really cool getting to see that really like what we're doing like with these meetings and meeting with our legislators really makes an impact. And this was my first Rare Disease Week, so it was awesome kind of getting to see that. And it was kind of really motivational for me to continue to participate in these events, seeing that it really does make a change and a difference. All right, so thank you so much to our panelists today. This was a really great conversation, and now I'll pass it back to Sarita.
I was just going to say, before you guys step away, there was a question that came in. It just came through on the chat, and it's asking, can anyone share a tip on how they personally overcame their self-doubt when it came to becoming an advocate? Would any one of you like to speak to that quickly before we wrap this session up?
I can speak on this one really quickly. I think the best thing for me was surrounding myself with people who would constantly reassure me that my voice did matter and that I was capable of doing this. So just finding some people who believe in you is a really great way to build yourself up to be confident in what you're doing.
And there are people out there, so be encouraged in knowing that. You just met a few today. You saw many of our bios, you have our emails and contact information. So even if you just drop a line and say, I want to do this and I'm scared, I don't know where to start. There are a lot of people here, just like there are a lot of people out there as well that are willing to help. So just find one of us and we will get you to where you need to be.
That's so great. And two, I think one of the other sessions, and you guys may have touched on it too, is just really recognizing that advocacy doesn't look the same for everybody. You know, you are in charge of what you want your advocacy journey to look like. So if you're interested, these are some great young folks. They did share in the chat too, just talking about how amazing it is to have so much information coming from you guys. So thank you so much for being here with us today.